Welcome, I invite you now, perhaps more deeply than before, to find a place of quietude, a sanctuary not just in the external world, but within the very core of your awareness. Allow the relentless pace of the day, the myriad demands and distractions of our modern existence to gently recede, like distant echoes fading across a vast landscape. Grant yourself permission to enter a space of deeper listening, of profound introspection. For tonight, we are not merely discussing a psychological concept. We are embarking on a deep, immersive, and extended journey into one of the most vital, enigmatic, complex, and tragically often profoundly neglected territories within the intricate map of the masculine psyche, the hidden, luminous, and sometimes perilous realm of the Anima. Perhaps you've sensed her subtle influence, or more accurately, the palpable void left by her conspicuous absence in the subtle currents shaping contemporary life and consciousness. It might manifest as that persistent low-grade hum of existential dissatisfaction that resonates beneath the polished surface of a seemingly successful, well-ordered existence, a melancholic undertone to even the brightest achievements. You look around, perhaps reflecting with unflinching honesty upon your own life's trajectory, perhaps observing with compassionate awareness the lives of the men who walk alongside you, fathers grappling with unspoken sorrows and unnamed longings, brothers navigating complex emotional currents with inadequate tools, partners yearning for a depth of connection that words consistently fail to capture, friends driven by restless ambition yet haunted by an inexplicable sense of inner emptiness, leaders wielding significant external power while seemingly disconnected from the grounding sources of internal wisdom and authentic feeling. You see competence, strategic thinking, rational control, the diligent acquisition of status symbols and material possessions, all the markers deemed valuable, even essential by our societal compass for masculine success. Yet alongside this outward striving, there often lingers a subtle psychic brittleness, an emotional guardedness that masquerades as strength but prevents true vulnerability, a fundamental difficulty in achieving and sustaining genuine soulful intimacy, a struggle to articulate the nuanced, often paradoxical language of the heart, or a quiet, pervasive desperation frequently masked by relentless activity, cynical detachment, performative achievement, addictive behaviors, or the pursuit of fleeting superficial gratifications. Where does this pervasive modern dis-ease, this spiritual ache beneath the glittering veneer of progress and technological advancement truly originate? Why, in an age that paradoxically promises unprecedented levels of global connection and material abundance, does an inner impoverishment, a subtle but profound soulful famine, seem to cast such a long and persistent shadow over the lives of so many men, leaving them feeling profoundly adrift, unmoored in a vast sea of superficial interactions and ultimately unfulfilling pursuits? Our contemporary world readily offers a cascade of explanations, each holding a fragment of the truth. The dizzying acceleration of technological change, constantly fragmenting our attention and altering our modes of connection. The relentless economic pressures demanding ceaseless performance and fostering pervasive anxiety. The complex and often confusing societal redefinition of traditional gender roles, leaving many feeling unmoored from familiar identities. The erosion of stable community structures and meaningful collective rituals that once provided containment and context, the overwhelming flood of information often devoid of deeper wisdom or grounding values. Even the increasingly prevalent reductionistic explanations focusing solely on neurochemical imbalances within the brain as the root of psychological suffering. These factors undoubtedly contribute intricate threads to the complex tapestry of modern human experience, shaping the landscape upon which our inner lives unfold. However, Carl Gustav Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist who possessed the extraordinary courage intellectual depth, and profound intuitive insight, to dedicate his entire life to mapping the vast, uncharted, often daunting territories of the human soul, pointed towards a deeper, more fundamental, and ultimately more psychologically significant source for this widespread spiritual and psychological malaise. He proposed with an insight that remains both radical in its implications and profoundly illuminating for understanding our current predicament, that modern man, particularly within the historical and cultural trajectory of Western civilization, with its emphasis on rationalism and extroversion, is suffering from the pervasive consequences of a profound collective and often entirely unconscious severance from an essential, life-giving aspect of his own psychic totality, the inner counterpart, the archetypal reality, the soul guide, the bridge to the unconscious, he named the Anima. Let us immediately and with firm resolve discard the simplistic and often misleading interpretations that frequently cloud discussions of this pivotal concept. The Anima is not merely a synonym for a man's vaguely defined feminine side, nor is she reducible to a checklist of culturally conditioned feminine traits, such as passivity, emotional lability, irrationality, or an inherent need for dependence. Stereotypes that ironically often serve to further devalue her true significance and discourage conscious engagement. Such reductions fundamentally misunderstand Jung's intention and trivialize the archetypal depth he sought to illuminate. The Anima, viewed within the intricate, dynamic, and deeply symbolic landscape of Jungian depth psychology, is far more than a collection of personality characteristics. She is a core archetype, a primordial universal pattern of psychological functioning embedded deep within the collective unconscious, the shared psychic inheritance connecting all humanity across vast stretches of evolutionary time and diverse cultural landscapes. She is most profoundly and essentially the man's innate embodied soul image, seelenbild, the living personification within his psyche of the Eros principle. Eros, in this specific Jungian context, represents the fundamental psychic drive and capacity for connection-relatedness, meaning derived from subjective feeling values, empathy, intuition, emotional depth, imagination, creativity born from receptivity, and the indispensable ability to build and maintain bridges between the conscious ego, the center of his waking identity and rational functioning, and the life-giving, symbolic, often overwhelming currents of the vast unconscious realm. She is, in essence, the psychic organ uniquely attuned to relating to the soul, both his own inner soul and, by extension, the soul of the world, what Jung sometimes termed the anima mundi. Jung's core assertion, therefore, carries immense weight and profound implications for understanding male psychology and development. To neglect, repress, devalue, project blindly, or remain entirely unconscious of the anima is not an act that fortifies or purifies masculinity according to some abstract ideal. It is an act that fundamentally impoverishes, fragments, and ultimately damages it, leaving it hollowed out from within, tragically disconnected from its own deepest roots and resources. This inner severance leads not to genuine strength, authentic resilience, or integrated wisdom, but often to a dangerous psychological one-sidedness, a compensatory rigidity in the conscious attitude, the persona, that masks an underlying fragility, emotional illiteracy, and profound vulnerability to unconscious forces. This inner split inevitably fuels destructive projections onto others, particularly onto women, poisoning the wells of potential intimacy and mutual understanding. It sabotages the capacity for true deep connection, leaving relationships feeling superficial, functional, or fraught with unconscious conflict and unmet needs. It stifles the wellsprings of authentic creativity, reducing it to mere technical skill, imitation, or compensatory striving. It disconnects the man from the intuitive wisdom of his body, and the grounding, healing presence of the natural world. And ultimately, it cuts him off from the very sources of intrinsic meaning, purpose, and vitality that make existence feel rich, resonant, significant, and truly worth the inherent struggles. In its most extreme manifestation, Jung chillingly suggested this profound disconnection from the soul image results in a state of psychic death. A man moving through the world perhaps with remarkable external efficiency, perhaps even achieving great power or status, yet fundamentally devoid of soul, a ghost haunting the corridors of his own meticulously constructed but ultimately empty life. Over the profound duration of our shared exploration tonight, an extended contemplation designed deliberately for deep listening absorption and perhaps even drifting into the liminal spaces between waking and dreaming, we will immerse ourselves fully in the multifaceted, paradoxical, and often deeply challenging reality of the anima. We will venture far beyond introductory definitions and superficial understandings to grapple with her inherent complexities, her intrinsic paradoxes, her capacity to manifest as both radiant light, the inspiring muse, the nurturing guide, and challenging shadow, the devouring mother, the seductive siren, the moody hysteric. We will explore her crucial, often overlooked role in psychological development, examining Jung's proposed stages of anima integration, from the purely instinctual connection to the attainment of profound wisdom. We will meticulously dissect with unflinching honesty the subtle and overt ways our culture, operating through ingrained family dynamics, often laden with powerful parental complexes, educational systems frequently prioritizing logos over eros, peer pressures enforcing rigid and often toxic masculine codes, media representations offering distorted and limiting images of both masculinity and femininity, and institutional structures habitually devaluing relational and emotional intelligence, systematically discourages the anima's authentic expression, forcing her potent energy into the unconscious realms where it becomes distorted, compensatory, fragmented, and potentially destructive. We will learn to decipher her often disguised symbolic language as it surfaces symptomatically in perplexing and persistent mood swings that seem to arise from nowhere in the adoption of seemingly irrational attachments and rigid opinions held with fierce conviction in stubborn creative blocks that stifle potential in corrosive possessive behaviors within relationships that masquerade as love but stem from fear, and in that pervasive, haunting sense of inner emptiness or meaninglessness that no amount of external success, validation, or distraction seems able to genuinely alleviate. We will undertake a deep, unflinching, and perhaps personally confronting analysis of the powerful mechanism of anima projection, exploring the almost magnetic, often bewildering forces that draw men towards certain women who seem often illusorily to embody their lost soul, leading inevitably through intoxicating yet ultimately unsustainable cycles of ecstatic idealization, possessive entanglement, bitter conflict, and often devastating disillusionment. We will examine how this dynamic shapes not only the landscape of romantic love, but also influences relationships with female colleagues, friends, mentors, and authority figures, often creating complex and challenging interpersonal dynamics rooted in these unconscious projections. Yet this extended contemplation is fundamentally oriented towards hope, potential transformation, and the arduous but achievable goal of psychological wholeness. Our ultimate aim is not simply to diagnose a widespread and profound wound that affects countless men and the culture they inhabit, but more importantly to illuminate the intricate, demanding, yet ultimately life-affirming path towards healing and integration that Jung so powerfully and courageously articulated throughout his extensive life's work. We will explore the courageous, often countercultural, deeply personal, and profoundly introspective inner work required for a man to consciously encounter acknowledge without immediate judgment, patiently differentiate her influence from that of his ego and his complexes, and diligently cultivate a mature, dynamic, respectful, and ongoing relationship with his anima, his inner soul image. We will uncover and celebrate the immense psychological treasures, the profound life enhancements, the vitalizing energies that are unlocked through this challenging yet essential integrative process, the reawakening of dormant creative potential across all life domains, the flowering of genuine emotional intelligence and profound empathy, the hard-won capacity for sustainable, deeply satisfying, and truly mutual intimacy, the discovery of authentic purpose rooted in inner values and soul guidance, rather than solely in external validation or societal expectations, and the transformative emergence of a renewed masculinity. A masculinity that is not diminished, not weakened, not somehow feminized in a reductive or stereotypical sense, but is rather deepened, enriched, humanized, made resilient, flexible, compassionate, and truly whole by courageously embracing its inherent psychic complementarity, by achieving a conscious dynamic equilibrium and inner sacred marriage, conjunctio, between the structuring power of logos and the connecting wisdom of eros. So I invite you now once more, and perhaps with even greater intention, to settle more deeply into this shared receptive space. Allow your breath to be your anchor, grounding you gently in the present moment, creating a calm center amidst the potential complexities we are about to explore. Permit your analytical mind, your critical faculties, your habitual ways of knowing to soften their insistent grip, slightly creating spaciousness alongside your heart, your intuition, your capacity for feeling resonance. Approach this extended exploration not merely as an exercise in acquiring intellectual knowledge or psychological categorization, but as a potential opportunity for profound introspection, for illuminating self-discovery, for cultivating greater compassion and understanding, perhaps for the intricate landscapes within yourself, perhaps for the often unseen, unspoken inner struggles of the men who share your life's journey. We are about to descend together patiently and respectfully into the often unseen, luminous, paradoxical, perilous, yet ultimately life-giving inner landscape, where the conscious masculine ego encounters its soul, its anima. Let us begin this deep dive now by moving far beyond the superficialities, by truly decoding the intricate nature of the soul image, and by fully grasping the anima's vital, structural, functional, and irreplaceable role as the living bridge to the boundless ocean of the unconscious. To truly embark on this exploration of the anima, we must first rigorously divest ourselves of the superficial interpretations that clutter popular understanding. The anima in the profound psychological architecture mapped by Carl Jung is infinitely more than a mere feminine side residing within a man, nor is she simply an internalized collection of traits culturally designated as female. Such notions drastically underestimate her archetypal power and her fundamental role in psychic life. To grasp the anima's significance, and consequently the gravity of her neglect, requires us to think archetypally, functionally, and symbolically, moving beyond the limitations of conventional gender discourse. She is, in essence, the very personification of a man's connection to the eros principle, the mediator of soul and the indispensable bridge to the vast, life-giving territories of the unconscious. Jung's formulation challenges us to think beyond conventional categories and grasp the anima as an essential element for psychological wholeness, a psychic reality as fundamental as any biological drive, whose presence or absence profoundly shapes the texture and meaning of a man's existence. Jung's framework fundamentally rests on the concept of archetypes operating within the collective unconscious. This layer of the psyche, deeper and more universal than the personal unconscious, which holds our individual repressed material, is the inherited psychic foundation of humankind. It doesn't contain specific memories, but rather innate universal patterns or potentialities for experience and representation. The archetypes. These are like the psychic DNA of our species, shaping how we instinctively respond to fundamental life situations. The encounter with parental figures, mother-father archetypes, the call to growth and challenge, hero archetype, the confrontation with our disowned aspects, shadow archetype, and significantly the relationship with the psychological representation of the other sex within us. The anima in men and the animus in women. Therefore, the anima is not something acquired solely through life experience, although these experiences are crucial in shaping how this innate archetype is constellated, colored, and expressed in his personal life, often becoming entangled with the powerful influence of the mother complex. The fundamental structure, the potential for relationship with this inner feminine principle is an intrinsic part of his psychological inheritance. She exists as a potentiality from birth, a latent image woven into the fabric of his being, waiting to be constellated by life's encounters and brought into conscious relationship through the arduous but necessary work of psychological development. What then does this archetypal feminine principle signify in purely psychological terms beyond the often limiting constraints of cultural stereotypes associated with gender? Jung often illuminated its nature by contrasting it with the complementary masculine principle, which he symbolically associated with logos. Logos represents the principle of focused consciousness discrimination, the crucial ability to separate, distinguish, and categorize, rational thought, objective analysis, structure, order, clarity, the power of the articulate word, and the drive towards intellectual understanding and mastery over the external world. Logos seeks to define, to establish boundaries, to apply logical principles, to understand how things work in a causal, sequential manner. It asks, what is it objectively? How does it function mechanistically? What are its distinct parts and how can they be ordered or controlled? The anima conversely embodies the principle of eros. Eros is fundamentally the principle of relatedness, of connection, binding, synthesis, psychic merging, in contrast to logos's differentiation, and the perception and assignment of value based on subjective feeling and intuitive apprehension. Eros operates through a more diffuse, holistic awareness, sensing the atmosphere of a situation, the emotional undercurrents beneath the surface, the intricate web of connections between seemingly separate entities, the feeling tone that permeates reality. Eros is less concerned with objective classification or linear causality, and more attuned to subjective meaning, intrinsic value, resonance, and the quality of relationship. Relationship not only with other human beings, but also with nature, with ideas, with symbols, with one's own inner world, and ultimately with the unifying, transcendent center of the psyche, which Jung termed the self. Eros seeks union, bridges apparent divides, fosters empathy and compassion, and values the unique particularity and subjective richness of lived experience. It asks not simply, what is the fact, but what is the connection here? How does this feel significant or valuable? What meaning does this hold within the larger tapestry of relationships? The anima therefore serves as the primary psychic vehicle, the internal organ of perception and expression, through which a man accesses, experiences, mediates, understands, and ultimately integrates the vital, life-affirming principle of Eros into his conscious awareness and his fundamental way of being in the world. Without her active conscious mediation, his capacity for deep relatedness, the very essence of Eros, remains largely unconscious, underdeveloped, defensively projected outward onto others, or operating only in primitive, undifferentiated, potentially destructive or compensatory ways. He might build impressive logical structures or achieve significant external power, logos, but these achievements will lack the essential mortar of felt connection, intrinsic meaning, and soulful resonance, eros, leaving him potentially successful but inwardly barren. This intrinsic link to relatedness, feeling depth, and the inner life leads directly and logically to Jung's designation of the anima as the soul image, Seelenbild. This term is not chosen lightly or merely for poetic effect. It points directly to the anima's core function as the carrier and mediator of soulfulness within the masculine psyche. Across diverse cultures, spiritual traditions, philosophical inquiries, and mythological systems throughout human history, the elusive yet essential quality we call soul, that animating principle, the locus of our deepest emotions and most cherished values, the source of intrinsic meaning and authentic purpose, the bridge connecting the mundane world to the transcendent or divine, the very essence of individual vitality and consciousness, distinct from mere biological mechanism or rational calculation, has consistently been symbolized, personified, or intrinsically associated with feminine figures and qualities. Consider, as we touched upon briefly, Psyche from Greek mythology, whose very name translates to soul or breath, and whose arduous transformative journey through numerous trials is fundamentally driven by her passionate, complex, and ultimately integrating relationship with Eros, love, leading to her own deification and wholeness. Think of Sophia, the central Gnostic personification of divine wisdom, often depicted as a feminine emanation whose initial, perhaps naive entanglement with the lower realms of matter and subsequent profound yearning for reunification with the divine light serves as a powerful and enduring allegory for the soul's journey through darkness, suffering, self-knowledge, and eventual spiritual integration. Reflect on the ubiquitous presence of goddesses across global pantheons, representing fertility, the creative matrix of life, compassion, healing, intuition, prophecy, the mysteries of the underworld, symbolically representing the depths of the unconscious, and the profound life-death rebirth cycle, all domains intimately connected to the lived experience of soul. Jung interpreted this remarkable symbolic consistency not as mere cultural coincidence, patriarchal projection of the other, or evidence of universal matriarchal origins, but as arising from a deep, shared archetypal intuition. Within the collective human psyche, the feminine archetype possesses an inherent profound resonance with and serves as the natural psychic container for those very qualities that constitute our lived experience of soulfulness. Thus, the anima is the man's inner figure who embodies his personal direct connection to this universal all-quality. She represents his access to the rich tapestry of the inner life, his capacity for the deep, nuanced feeling that imbues existence with texture, value, and significance, his intuition that offers guidance and insight beyond the reach of logic, his relationship to mystery symbol and the numinous, his untapped creative potential that springs forth from the fertile depths of the unconscious, and his fundamental link to the anima mundi, the soul of the world, and the very life force that animates his being and connects him to the whole of existence. She is, in a very real and functional sense, the guardian of his inner sanctum, the psychopomp guiding him through the often confusing inner realms, the mediator of his most profound spiritual longings and deepest emotional experiences. Without a conscious connection to her, he remains in a crucial sense soulless, adrift from his own deepest center. Perhaps the most critical functional aspect of the anima, and the one whose disruption leads inevitably to the most severe consequences for overall psychological health, adaptation, and the possibility of achieving wholeness, is her indispensable role as a bridge, the vital, dynamic, and often precarious link facilitating communication and regulating the flow of psychic energy between the relatively small, well-lit island of the conscious ego and the immense, largely unknown, and potentially overwhelming continent of the unconscious. The ego as the center of our waking awareness and the seat of our personal identity, I, is necessarily selective in its focus and inherently limited in its scope. It operates primarily within the realm of the known, the rational, the seemingly controllable aspects of experience, largely oriented towards the crucial tasks of adapting to the demands of external reality, maintaining a stable and coherent sense of self. Over time, making logical decisions and filtering out the constant barrage of internal and external stimuli deemed irrelevant or potentially threatening to its stability. The unconscious, however, encompasses everything else, a vast, ancient, multi-layered landscape containing not only our personal history, submerged below the threshold of immediate awareness, forgotten childhood memories, impactful but unintegrated life experiences, repressed traumas and painful emotions, undeveloped talents and potentials that conflict with our conscious self-image, subliminal perceptions that constantly shape our reactions without our knowing, but also the immense transpersonal reservoir of the collective unconscious. This deeper layer teems with powerful archetypal energies, like the shadow, the persona, the self, as well as the anima, animus, instinctual patterns honed over millennia of human evolution, symbolic imagery common to all humanity, found in myths, fairy tales, religious motifs, and the accumulated psychic residue, both the radiant wisdom and the terrifying darkness of the entire human journey. This unconscious realm is both the source of immense creative and healing power, the wellspring of libido, the fundamental life energy itself, and the potential origin of overwhelming psychic disruption, debilitating neurosis, disturbing complexes, and even psychotic fragmentation, if its potent contents erupt into consciousness without adequate mediation, containment, or the capacity for conscious integration. The anima stands precisely at the crucial, often perilous threshold between these two worlds, consciousness and the unconscious. She acts as the skilled mediator, the sensitive interpreter, the reliable diplomat, the psychopomp, soul guide, who facilitates a regulated, meaningful, and potentially transformative exchange across this vital border. She helps translate the often paradoxical, non-linear, highly charged and deeply symbolic language of the unconscious, expressed primarily through the compelling imagery and narratives of dreams, through potent waking fantasies and imagination, through sudden flashes of intuition, through powerful and sometimes inexplicable moods, through physical symptoms carrying psychological meaning, and through meaningful coincidences or synchronicities, into forms that the conscious ego can begin to perceive, comprehend, grapple with, relate to, and ultimately integrate into a larger, more complete sense of self. She allows the life-giving energy, the creative inspiration, the compensatory insights that correct the inevitable one-sidedness of the ego, and the necessary warnings emerging from the depths to reach the conscious mind without flooding, overwhelming, or destabilizing its structure. Conversely, she also plays a crucial, though often less recognized, role in carrying the conscious attitudes, ethical considerations, lived experiences, and developmental achievements of the ego back into the unconscious, influencing its deeper processes and facilitating a gradual reciprocal integration of the entire personality structure around the central organizing principle of the self. A healthy, dynamic, flexible, permeable, yet discerning and consciously tended anima bridge is therefore absolutely essential for maintaining psychological balance, enabling successful adaptation to life's complex challenges, fostering ongoing creative vitality and renewal, facilitating emotional maturity and relational depth, and supporting the entire lifelong, often arduous, yet ultimately most meaningful human project of individuation, the journey towards becoming a psychologically whole, unique, authentic, and consciously integrated individual, centered not solely in the limited perspective of the ego, but in the larger, more comprehensive paradoxical reality of the self. When this vital bridge is structurally damaged, perhaps through early developmental trauma or profound neglect, remains underdeveloped due to a lack of nurturing relational experiences or consistent cultural devaluation, or is consciously dismantled and defensively rejected through rigid adherence to narrow cultural norms, demanding a purely masculine, logos-dominated psychic posture. The consequences for the psyche are profound and inevitably lead to a state of debilitating fragmentation. The ego becomes perilously isolated, cut off from its own psychic roots, starved of the regulating feedback from the unconscious, deprived of the nourishing flow of libido, from the depths denied the guiding wisdom of instinct and intuition. Like a sophisticated computer disconnected from both its power source and the network, it might retain its operational protocols for a time, perhaps even functioning with impressive logical precision within its limited sphere, but it lacks real energy, cannot receive crucial updates or compensatory information from the wider psychic system, and eventually becomes obsolete, prone to malfunction, or develops rigid, inefficient routines. This isolated ego often attempts to compensate for its precarious position and underlying sense of emptiness through defensive inflation, lacking the genuine grounding and stabilizing influence of the self. Often mediated by the anima, the ego develops an exaggerated sense of its own importance, rationality, self-sufficiency, and control. It rigidly adheres to its limited conscious worldview, mistaking its small, brightly illuminated circle of awareness for the entirety of existence, often becoming arrogant, dogmatic, and dismissively contemptuous of the vast unconscious territory, including feeling, intuition, and the body. It has defensively walled itself off from this inflated state, built upon a fragile foundation of denial and profound disconnection from its own psychic matrix, is inherently unstable, brittle, resistant to feedback, and profoundly vulnerable to sudden catastrophic collapse when inevitably confronted by the ignored realities of the unconscious, erupting as overwhelming symptoms or by the messy, unpredictable, often tragic complexities of life that ultimately defy purely rational mastery and control. Alternatively, the isolated ego, starved of the life-giving psychic energy, libido, mediated by the anima, can become chronically depleted and deflated. This state manifests as a pervasive sense of meaninglessness, profound apathy, chronic fatigue that seems unrelated to physical exertion, creative sterility, social withdrawal, or a vague but persistent underlying depression. The man finds himself living predominantly in his head, alienated from the vitality of his feelings, the wisdom of his body, the nourishing potential of deep relationships, and the larger sense of purpose and connection that arises naturally from an integrated relationship with his soul. He might function adequately, perhaps even achieving significant external success, according to conventional societal metrics driven by sheer willpower, compensatory ambition, or adherence to duty, logos. But the inner world remains barren, desolate, haunted by a quiet despair, or a restless, unsatisfied seeking for something indefinable, something essential that remains perpetually missing, because the indispensable bridge-keeper, the anima, has been systematically exiled, ignored, pathologized, misunderstood, or tragically underdeveloped within his own psyche. It becomes undeniably clear when viewed through this comprehensive Jungian lens and recognizing the profound functional necessity of the anima that she represents, far more than a simplistic feminine side, to be optionally cultivated or conveniently ignored according to cultural whim. She is a fundamental archetypal reality, a crucial psychological function, the very mediator of soulfulness, relatedness, creativity, intuition, and vital connection to the unconscious depths within the masculine psyche. Her conscious integration is not an elective enhancement for the sensitive few, nor is it a threat to authentic masculinity. It is rather a fundamental requirement for achieving psychological wholeness, emotional maturity, relational depth, creative vitality, spiritual grounding, and the capacity to live a truly meaningful, deeply human life. The cultural forces that systematically devalue and repress her, therefore inflict a profound wound not only upon the potential development of individual men, but upon the collective soul of our time, contributing significantly to the widespread sense of disconnection, fragmentation, and existential malaise that characterizes so much of modern existence. Understanding the profound value she represents is the essential first step before we can fully comprehend the pervasive cultural mechanisms that so often lead to her tragic exile from conscious life and the often perplexing symptoms that inevitably arise from her persistent neglect. The psychological landscape of the modern man, so frequently marked by a poignant, often unspoken disconnection from the depths of emotional experience and the richness of soulful connection, is not a terrain shaped solely by the vagaries of individual temperament or the conscious choices made in adulthood. It is, to a significant and often underestimated degree, sculpted, constrained, and sometimes tragically distorted by the powerful, pervasive, and deeply ingrained currents of cultural conditioning. The journey away from a conscious, vital relationship with the anima, that essential inner counterpart, the soul image, rarely begins as a deliberate act of personal rejection in maturity. Instead, it unfolds gradually, often insidiously, commencing in the earliest years of life, through a complex and multifaceted system of implicit and explicit societal messages, familial dynamics shaped by generational patterns, educational structures with inherent biases, peer interactions enforcing rigid norms, media portrayals offering limited archetypes, and institutional values that collectively conspire to enforce a narrow, restrictive, and ultimately psychologically impoverishing definition of acceptable masculinity. Carl Jung, with his keen historical and anthropological sensibility, was profoundly aware of this dynamic, viewing the widespread emotional constriction, relational difficulties, and underlying psychic fragmentation he observed in countless modern men, not primarily as inherent character flaws or individual pathologies, but rather as the painful, predictable consequences of navigating a cultural environment that demands the often unconscious sacrifice of essential eros-related capacities. The very domain of the anima, on the altar of achieving and maintaining a socially sanctioned or logos-dominant masculine identity. Understanding the specific mechanisms through which this cultural stifling operates is absolutely crucial for appreciating why so many men arrive at adulthood already fundamentally alienated from vital parts of their own psyche, and why the subsequent journey towards reclaiming and integrating the anima often feels like a strenuous countercultural act, akin to swimming upstream against a powerful, deeply entrenched societal current. The process of shaping the male psyche away from anima connection often commences in the formative years of early childhood, subtly yet relentlessly interfering with the natural psychological androgyny and emotional fluidity typically observable in very young boys. While an infant or toddler might express a wide spectrum of emotions, joy, distress, fear, tenderness, anger, curiosity, with relative spontaneity and lack of self-consciousness, and explore a diverse range of interests without rigid adherence to later gender categorizations. The forces of socialization soon intervene, guided by the prevailing cultural scripts about appropriate gender roles and expectations, held often unconsciously by parents, caregivers, and the wider community. Emotional policing, as previously termed, emerges as one of the earliest, most direct and arguably most damaging mechanisms in this process. A boy's natural expressions of feelings deemed unmanly by the surrounding culture, particularly sadness, fear, hurt, vulnerability, overt displays of affection beyond a certain age, or even intense empathy, are frequently met not with acceptance and validation, but with a range of discouraging responses. Tears might be ignored, minimized, "You're okay, it's nothing," actively shamed, "Stop that crying. Only babies or girls cry like that. Don't be such a sissy." Or met with commands demanding immediate suppression and control. "Be tough, shake it off, control yourself, act like a man." He learns through countless such interactions, reinforced by observing how other males are treated and how they behave, that a significant portion of his authentic inner emotional landscape is not only unacceptable but potentially dangerous, inviting ridicule, rejection, or the withdrawal of love and approval. While certain forms of anger or assertive aggression, particularly within controlled contexts like sports or competition, might be implicitly tolerated or even encouraged as signs of masculine strength or passion, the vast spectrum of softer psyche, more relational, receptive, or vulnerable emotions intrinsically associated with eros and mediated by the anima are systematically discouraged, pathologized, or driven underground. He internalizes a strict, often crippling emotional code. Certain feelings are permissible, others are liabilities to be hidden at all costs. He learns to distrust the validity of his own inner feeling, states to build formidable internal defenses against experiencing or expressing vulnerability, and perhaps most tragically to equate emotional suppression with desirable masculine strength and control. The anima, the very archetype that embodies this rich, nuanced world of differentiated feeling and authentic connection, becomes unconsciously associated with shame, weakness, inadequacy, and the constant threat of social failure. This process is not about learning healthy emotional regulation, which involves acknowledging, understanding, and consciously managing feelings. It is often about learning profound emotional repression and dissociation, a fundamental cutting off from the authentic signals arising from his own soul. Simultaneously, and often working in tandem with emotional policing, a process of interest channeling and shaming subtly steers the boy's developing interests and activities away from domains naturally aligned with anima expression. A boy might exhibit a natural inclination towards activities that engage eros and the imaginal realm, perhaps losing himself for hours in imaginative play, focused on intricate relational dynamics between figures, showing a deep fascination with the expressive power of art, music, dance, or storytelling, demonstrating a pronounced sensitivity and connection to the natural world, or displaying a naturally nurturing and empathetic disposition towards animals, plants, or younger siblings. These inclinations, however, which represent the nascent stirrings of anima, potential finding expression, might be met with subtle indifference, gentle redirection towards pursuits deemed more practical or gender appropriate, or even outright ridicule or shaming. "That's girls' stuff." He might hear explicitly or implicitly, "Why don't you go outside and play ball? Stop daydreaming and focus on your math homework. Real boys like trucks and tools, not drawing flowers." He might be consistently praised and rewarded primarily for achievements in areas culturally coded as unequivocally masculine, excelling in competitive sports, emphasizing physical dominance, demonstrating aptitude for mechanical or technological problem solving, focusing on objective logic, engaging in activities involving building, fixing, controlling, or conquering the external environment. The powerful unspoken and sometimes spoken message absorbed over years of such differential reinforcement is that the inner world, the realm of feeling, subjective experience, imagination, beauty symbol, intuition, and deep interpersonal connection, the anima's natural habitat is somehow less important, less valuable, less real, or simply less relevant to achieving success, respect, and acceptance as a man in the prevailing cultural milieu than the outer world of tangible accomplishment, rational mastery, competitive striving, and objective control. Consequently, he learns often unconsciously to devalue these aspects within himself, to neglect the cultivation of anima-related skills and sensitivities, and to direct his primary developmental energy towards mastering the logos function and constructing an externally focused, socially approved masculine persona. His innate connection to the anima's world, lacking encouragement and validation, begins to atrophy from disuse, if not from active suppression, driven by the fear of social disapproval or internalized shame. The influence of relational modeling during these formative years is profoundly impactful and often operates entirely beneath the threshold of conscious awareness, shaping the boy's internal blueprint for masculinity. Boys learn what it means to be a man, how to navigate the world, how to relate to others, and how to manage their inner lives primarily through observing, identifying with, and internalizing the behaviors, attitudes, communication styles, and emotional expressions, or lack thereof, demonstrated by the significant male figures in their environment. If fathers, grandfathers, uncles, older brothers, respected teachers, coaches, mentors, and the dominant male figures portrayed relentlessly in media and popular culture consistently embody a constricted form of masculinity, characterized perhaps by emotional reserve or outright stoicism, a palpable discomfort with or dismissal of vulnerability and deep feeling, a primary life focus centered on work, career status, and external achievement, often at the expense of deep relational connection. Communication patterns that heavily favor rational discourse, problem-solving, or action over nuanced emotional expression, or empathic listening, difficulty with intimacy, beyond the functional or sexual, and perhaps even subtle or overt displays of misogyny or denigration of feminine concerns and qualities. This limited and often fragmented model becomes the powerful internalized template for acceptable and desirable manhood. The boy unconsciously absorbs the message that embracing the qualities intrinsically associated with the anima, such as emotional sensitivity, relational depth, intuitive awareness, vulnerability, nurturing capacity, is fundamentally incompatible with achieving the kind of masculine identity that garners respect, admiration, and success within his social world. The tragic scarcity within many contemporary cultural contexts of visible, accessible, relatable, and respected male role models who successfully integrate both traditional masculine strengths like assertiveness, rationality, competence, and well-developed eros capacities like empathy, vulnerability, relational attunement, creative intuition, leaves the developing boy without a viable, attractive map or compass for navigating his own complex inner landscape constructively. He may feel psychologically forced into a false dichotomy, compelled to choose between conforming to the limited, often anima-repressing model presented to him, risking inner fragmentation and soul loss, and attempting to explore his anima potential in isolation and secrecy, often burdened by profound feelings of shame, confusion, inadequacy, or the fear of betraying the very definition of manhood he has been taught to emulate. This lack of integrated elder wisdom creates a significant obstacle to healthy male psychological development. The formal education system, despite ongoing efforts towards pedagogical reform and gender equity, often continues structurally and implicitly to reinforce the broader cultural overvaluation of logos at the expense of eros, thereby contributing, however unintentionally, to the societal marginalization of the anima's domain and its associated ways of knowing. The very structure of schooling, with its emphasis on standardized curricula, quantifiable outcomes, and hierarchical progression, frequently favors and rewards logos-based competencies, analytical reasoning, critical thinking based on objective evidence memorization and recall of factual information, logical argumentation, linear problem solving, and the efficient processing of abstract concepts. While these skills are undeniably crucial for navigating the complexities of the modern technological and information-driven world, the relative underemphasis in many educational paradigms on the systematic development of equally vital eros-based capacities can leave many boys, and indeed all students, though perhaps differentially impacted based on gendered expectations, with an underdeveloped capacity to navigate their inner world, understand complex human relationships, and engage with life from a place of emotional intelligence and soulful meaning. Skills such as deep empathy, nuanced interpersonal communication, collaborative problem-solving that values relationship as much as outcome, intuitive insight, creative thinking that embraces ambiguity and paradox, sophisticated symbolic interpretation, crucial for understanding art, literature, dreams, and deeper cultural meanings, and ethical reflection grounded in integrated feeling values are often treated as secondary soft skills, peripheral to the core academic mission, rather than being recognized as fundamental components of human intelligence, psychological well-being, and effective citizenship. Subjects traditionally rich in anima expression and symbolic depth. The arts, visual, performing, musical, literature, poetry, mythology, comparative religion, certain branches of philosophy focusing on ethics and existential meaning, may receive less funding, less curricular emphasis, be perceived as less rigorous, or deemed less practically relevant for future career success compared to the seemingly more objective and useful STEM fields: science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Furthermore, the very atmosphere prevalent in many highly competitive academic environments can implicitly discourage emotional expression, vulnerability, or collaborative learning, favoring instead detached intellectualism, individual achievement, and assertive debate. The hidden curriculum subtly but powerfully conveys the pervasive cultural message that the rational, the measurable, the objective, and the technologically controllable aspects of reality hold greater inherent value and significance than the subjective, qualitative, relational, intuitive, symbolic, and often ambiguous realm of the soul, feeling, and intrinsic meaning, further alienating the developing psyche, particularly the male psyche already culturally conditioned to prioritize logos. From the anima's essential perspective, wisdom, and life-enriching contribution. Finally, as boys navigate the turbulent passage through puberty and adolescence, seeking identity and belonging outside the immediate family structure, the crucible of peer pressure often becomes the most potent, immediate, and sometimes ruthless enforcer of conformity to narrow, often highly stereotypical, and frequently toxic masculine norms, establishing and maintaining status and acceptance within the male peer group. During this intensely vulnerable developmental stage, frequently requires strict adherence to an often unspoken but rigidly enforced code of conduct. This code commonly mandates displays of toughness, often equating to the suppression of nearly all emotions, except anger or performative bravado, a visceral rejection of vulnerability or any perceived sign of weakness, engagement in relentless competition, whether in sports, academics, social status, attracting romantic partners, or displays of risk-taking, prioritizing unwavering group loyalty over individual conscience or feeling, and sometimes, tragically, active participation in the denigration, objectification, or bullying of girls, non-conforming male peers, including those perceived as too sensitive, too intellectual, too artistic, or insufficiently aggressive, or anyone associated symbolically with the feminine or perceived weakness. Expressing deep sensitivity or empathy, admitting fear, self-doubt, or confusion, showing strong emotional attachment beyond acceptable forms of male camaraderie, displaying intense interest in pursuits deemed non-masculine, like art, poetry, or deep introspection, or challenging group norms based on personal feeling or ethical conviction, can invite swift, severe, and often deeply wounding social consequences. Ridicule, exclusion, physical intimidation, accusations of being gay, used as a derogatory term regardless of actual orientation, or being branded as not a real man. The intense psychological need for belonging, acceptance, and validation from peers during adolescence makes resisting this immense pressure incredibly difficult for most young men. Consequently, this period often marks a critical juncture where any remaining conscious connection to authentic anima qualities is definitively severed, defensively rejected, or driven deep into the shadow. A more rigid, often brittle, sometimes aggressively performative, hyper-masculine persona is solidified, not necessarily reflecting the boy's true nature, but serving as an essential social survival strategy within the demanding, often unforgiving adolescent male social environment. The shame associated with any perceived failure to perfectly embody this narrow, often contradictory masculine code can become deeply ingrained, creating lasting psychic scars, reinforcing patterns of emotional repression, and erecting formidable internal obstacles to any future attempts at consciously reconnecting with and integrating the repressed anima potential in adulthood. The cumulative, interwoven, and often tragically effective impact of these pervasive cultural forces, the early and ongoing emotional policing within the family, the subtle and overt channeling of interests away from eros domains in education and society, the profound scarcity of integrated male role models demonstrating a healthy balance, the structural biases favoring logos within many institutions, and the intense, often brutal, pressure of peer conformity during adolescence results in the systematic repression, pervasive devaluation, and ultimately the profound alienation from the anima within the psychological development of countless men. It is a process deeply embedded in the very fabric of many societies, subtly yet powerfully shaping identity, relationships, values, and life trajectories, often entirely without the individual's conscious awareness, critical reflection, or explicit consent. The man learns through 1,000 subtle and overt lessons, assimilated over years to construct and diligently inhabit a socially sanctioned masculine persona, emphasizing qualities like strength, rationality, competence, independence, emotional control, and relentless external achievement. However, the very maintenance of this culturally approved, often idealized facade necessitates the active, ongoing repression of the anima, with her associated vital world of feeling, intuition, vulnerability, relatedness, creativity, embodied wisdom, and connection to the symbolic depths, into the vast, potent, dynamic, and often volatile shadow of the unconscious. This act of profound psychological self-division, undertaken often unconsciously in the seemingly necessary pursuit of adaptation, social acceptance, belonging, and conventional success, comes at an enormous, though frequently hidden until later life, psychological cost. It lays the foundational groundwork for the internal conflicts, the relational dysfunctions, the creative blocks, the pervasive sense of meaninglessness, and the eventual eruption of compensatory symptoms that Jung identified as the hallmarks of the significant anima wound in modern man, a wound whose specific, often perplexing manifestations we must now explore in greater detail. When a fundamental psychic structure and archetype as vital and energy-laden as the anima, representing the very principle of eros and the connection to soul, is systematically denied conscious recognition, integration and value within the masculine psyche. Its potent energy does not simply vanish into thin air or lie passively dormant. Within the intricate self-regulating dynamics of the psyche, as Carl Jung meticulously observed and articulated throughout his work, repressed psychic energy behaves according to fundamental psychological laws akin to the conservation of energy in physics. It transforms, it accumulates immense pressure behind the dams of conscious defense mechanisms, and it inevitably seeks expression, often bursting forth through alternative, indirect, distorted, compensatory, and seemingly irrational pathways. The man who has painstakingly constructed his conscious identity, his functional persona, around the seemingly solid and socially rewarded pillars of logos, unwavering rationality, stoic emotional control, self-reliant independence, objective achievement, decisive action, often finds himself profoundly bewildered, disturbed, internally conflicted, and even actively sabotaged by the unwelcome emergence of inner states and outward behaviors that seem utterly alien, contradictory, illogical, and inexplicable to his carefully curated self-image. These perplexing manifestations are the often subtle yet profoundly significant symptoms of anima possession. This crucial Jungian term does not imply demonic influence in a literal supernatural sense, but rather describes a complex psychological state wherein the unconscious, underdeveloped, often negatively charged, and autonomous feminine complex begins to exert an undue, compulsive, and disruptive influence over the man's moods, thoughts, judgments, perceptions, and actions, operating largely outside the purview and control of his conscious ego. Learning to recognize these diverse symptoms, not as inherent character flaws, inexplicable weaknesses, random biochemical fluctuations, or signs of impending madness, but rather as coded communications, as desperate, albeit distorted distress signals emanating from the neglected depths of the soul, is an absolutely crucial step towards achieving accurate self-understanding, initiating the necessary process of healing, and ultimately reclaiming a path towards greater psychological wholeness and integration. One of the most frequent, classically described, and often most confusing symptom clusters revolves around pervasive, unpredictable, and seemingly irrational moodiness. The man whose conscious ego ideal is one of unwavering emotional stability, logical consistency, and unflappable control might find himself inexplicably adrift on volatile inner seas, subject to sudden and intense shifts in affect that feel entirely beyond his command. This is critically different from the natural, nuanced ebb and flow of differentiated feeling that characterizes emotional maturity. Instead, it is the eruption of raw, overwhelming, often primitive affect, breaking through the ego's increasingly strained defenses. He might experience sudden explosive flares of intense irritability or disproportionate rage triggered by seemingly minor frustrations, perceived slights, or disruptions to his routine. Reactions that feel far out of sync with the external situation and often leave him feeling ashamed, confused, or defensively justifying his outburst afterwards. He might at other times sink into prolonged periods of vague, objectless melancholy, a heavy, soul-crushing lethargy, or profound apathy that drains his motivation, clouds his thinking, dampens his vitality, and colors his entire perception of the world in shades of gray, frequently without any identifiable external cause that his rational mind can pinpoint. Conversely, he might find himself ambushed by unexpected moments of exaggerated or inappropriate sentimentality, becoming uncharacteristically tearful over trivialities, a sad song on the radio, a sentimental advertisement, clinging fiercely to nostalgic fantasies about an idealized past, or expressing overly romanticized ideals about love or beauty that feel jarringly out of sync with his usual pragmatic or cynical demeanor. Another common manifestation is sullen, uncommunicative withdrawal. He might retreat into a brooding silence radiating unspoken resentment, hurt or negativity, unable or unwilling to articulate the source of his discontent, pushing away attempts at connection or support, and leaving those around him feeling confused, frustrated, rejected, or walking on eggshells. What unites these disparate and often contradictory mood states is typically their lack of clear proportionality to immediate external circumstances, their resistance to logical explanation or conscious volitional control, and their profoundly ego-dystonic quality. The man feels possessed by the mood, as if it's an alien force acting upon him, rather than consciously experiencing and relating to a specific, understandable emotion arising from within. Jung interpreted this phenomenon as the direct consequence of the feeling function intrinsically linked to the anima and the eros principle remaining largely undifferentiated, underdeveloped, and operating autonomously from the unconscious. Because this vital function hasn't been consciously acknowledged, valued, cultivated, refined, and integrated into the fabric of the conscious personality structure, its potent energy erupts in these primitive, archaic, often compensatory, emotionally overwhelming, and seemingly uncontrollable forms whenever the ego's defensive structures inevitably falter under stress or internal pressure. He is not skillfully navigating the complex river of his feeling life. He is being periodically and often traumatically drowned by its unpredictable and overwhelming floods. This internal chaos is deeply unsettling and often leads to a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle. The disturbing power of these moods reinforces his deeply ingrained belief that feelings are inherently dangerous, irrational, and must be suppressed at all costs, leading to even more strenuous efforts at repression, which in turn builds greater unconscious pressure, making future potentially even more intense eruptions virtually inevitable. Closely intertwined with this raw, undifferentiated moodiness is a compensatory tendency towards vague, impersonal, and often superficial sentimentality. When the capacity for genuine, nuanced, deeply felt, subjectively authentic emotion is underdeveloped or largely inaccessible due to chronic anima repression, the psyche and its inherent drive towards balance may attempt to fill the resulting affective void with a kind of imitation feeling, a pseudo-emotionality. The man might find himself surprisingly susceptible to cultural cliches, overly simplistic narratives of romance or heroism, patriotic fervor detached from critical examination, saccharine expressions of spirituality that bypass genuine struggle, or maudlin displays of emotion evoked by conventional triggers, like manipulative films or predictable song lyrics. Yet simultaneously, he might struggle profoundly to connect with, understand, or respond appropriately to the specific, complex, often messy and uncomfortable feelings of real people in his actual life, including most significantly himself. He might hold highly idealized, abstract notions about fundamental life experiences, woman as an ethereal concept rather than a complex individual, true love as a perfect conflict-free fantasy, nature as a pristine romantic backdrop, soul as a comforting philosophical idea rather than a challenging inner reality. This pervasive sentimentality often feels strangely hollow, impersonal, or even performative because it lacks the crucial grounding in authentic, differentiated, subjective lived experience that characterizes mature, integrated feeling. It can function often unconsciously as a sophisticated defense mechanism, allowing the man to project an image of emotional sensitivity, depth, or spiritual attunement, while simultaneously avoiding the more demanding, vulnerable, ambiguous, and often uncomfortable work of engaging directly with his own real complex, sometimes contradictory feelings and the equally complex emotional realities of others. He might mistake this superficial emotional reactivity This easily triggered sentimentality for genuine depth or sensitivity, further obscuring his fundamental disconnection from the discriminating wisdom and authentic connection provided by a consciously integrated feeling function mediated by the anima. It is the anima's energy seeking expression but finding only distorted outlets through the filters of cultural stereotype, defensive idealization, or unconscious compensation, lacking the clarity and authenticity that arise from conscious integration. The fundamental psychic drive of Eros, the very essence of the principle embodied and mediated by the anima, is towards connection, relationship, and union. However, when this powerful instinctual drive operates primarily from the unconscious, stemming from a place of inner fragmentation, profound insecurity, and unmet soulful needs, born of chronic anima neglect, it frequently becomes tragically distorted into problematic and often destructive relational dynamics, most notably manifesting as possessiveness, obsessive jealousy, and controlling behaviors within intimate partnerships. Lacking a secure, conscious internal connection with his own soul image, feeling psychically incomplete and fundamentally dependent on an external source for validation, meaning, and emotional grounding, the man unconsciously seeks to grasp, secure, dominate, and control the external woman, onto whom he has projected the vital, missing, and often idealized parts of himself. She becomes, in his psychic economy, the indispensable container for his very soul, and therefore any perceived threat to this external lifeline. Her attention turning towards others, her assertion of personal independence or autonomy, her having separate thoughts, feelings, or friendships, even her natural fluctuations in mood or availability, can trigger profound, often primitive anxiety and desperate reactive attempts to reassert control. This can manifest in myriad ways. Intense jealousy, often fueled by minimal or misinterpreted evidence, leading to constant suspicion. Intrusive questioning, monitoring of her communications or whereabouts, and irrational accusations of infidelity. Possessiveness, an underlying need to own her time, her attention, her affection, her very being, viewing her not as a separate, sovereign individual, but as an extension of himself, or a crucial component necessary for his own psychic stability and well-being. Controlling behaviors ranging from overt demands, restrictions on her freedom, and angry outbursts designed to intimidate, to more subtle forms of emotional manipulation like guilt-tripping, playing the victim, withholding affection, or creating dependency, all aimed at keeping her close, compliant, and securely bound to him. This complex of behaviors is fundamentally rooted not in the strength of love, but in the depth of his inner void and his profound, often unconscious, fear of abandonment, which ultimately represents a terrifying fear of confronting his own psychic incompleteness, his own disconnectedness from his soul, without the perceived safety net provided by the externalized, projected anima. This dynamic, tragically often mistaken by both partners, at least initially, for passionate intensity or profound devotion, inevitably poisons genuine intimacy, replacing trust with suspicion, mutual respect with dynamics of control and submission, and authentic connection with a desperate, anxious clinging, born of deep-seated inner insecurity and unresolved anima issues. Perhaps more paradoxically yet, a phenomenon frequently observed by Jung and subsequent depth psychologists, a man significantly possessed by his repressed anima can sometimes exhibit behaviors that seem on the surface more characteristic of what Jung described in his model as the negative animus in women, the unconscious masculine principle operating destructively. This surprising manifestation can include adopting rigid dogmatic opinions held with fierce, often irrational emotional intensity, particularly on abstract intellectual, political, or philosophical subjects, where differentiated feeling might normally provide nuance and balance. He might become prone to petty argumentation, engaging in relentless logical hair-splitting, focusing obsessively on minor details or semantic points while completely missing the larger emotional or relational context of a discussion. There might be a noticeable tendency towards critical gossip, making sharp-cutting remarks about others, or engaging in passive-aggressive communication, often disguised sometimes quite cleverly as objective observation, rational critique, or even witty humor. How can the neglect of the inner feminine principle possibly lead to such seemingly masculine forms of negativity? Jung's complex understanding of psychic dynamics suggested that when a primary psychological function, such as feeling eros mediated by the anima, remains deeply unconscious, undifferentiated, and charged with repressed energy, often stemming from feelings of inadequacy, resentment, or bitterness related to its neglect. This potent energy can leak into contaminate and fundamentally distort the operation of other psychological functions, particularly thinking, logos, and sometimes intuition, unacknowledged, unprocessed emotions. Perhaps profound insecurity about his own relational capacities, deep-seated resentment towards perceived slights, envy of those who seem more emotionally fluent, or bitterness stemming from past relationship failures attributed externally, can masquerade as objective opinions or logical arguments. The man adopts rigid black and white stances not primarily out of reasoned conviction, based on evidence or principle, but because these positions serve as unconscious outlets for this dammed-up, negatively charged emotional energy. He argues fiercely and often irrationally about impersonal details or abstract principles because the real personal emotional issues driving the conflict remain inaccessible to his conscious awareness or feel too threatening and vulnerable to acknowledge directly. He might wield pseudo-logic sharp criticism or dismissive sarcasm as weapons, projecting his own inner bitterness, frustration, or sense of powerlessness outward in a way that appears intellectually assertive or critically astute, but is actually fueled by distorted, unconscious, negatively toned feeling. This intellectualized negativity, this peculiar form of psychic bitchiness, to employ Jung's potentially problematic but descriptively potent term in this specific context, represents the frustrated, wounded anima, acting out her distress indirectly through the channels of a logos function that has become untethered from its necessary grounding in integrated conscious feeling and relational awareness. Deep beneath these often confusing and contradictory outward symptoms, the volatile moods, the hollow sentimentality, the possessive anxieties, the irrational opinions, frequently lies a pervasive, though often fiercely denied and heavily defended, against sense of inferiority, particularly concerning the traditional domains associated with the anima and the eros: principal emotional depth and expressive capacity, relational competence, and the ability to sustain intimacy, intuitive insight and sensitivity to nuance, creative spontaneity, and symbolic imagination, aesthetic appreciation, and the skillful navigation of complex social and interpersonal dynamics. The man, profoundly disconnected from his soul image, despite any outward displays of confidence or achievement, often harbors secret gnawing doubts about his own intrinsic worth, his fundamental lovability, his capacity to truly connect, his creative potential, or his grasp of life's deeper meanings and subtleties. He may unconsciously feel clumsy, inadequate, or fundamentally lacking in comparison to women, onto whom he projects idealized anima capacities, or even in comparison to other men who seem more naturally attuned to these relational and emotional dimensions. This painful, often deeply buried feeling of inner inferiority is intolerable to the conscious ego, especially one invested in a persona of strength and competence, and is therefore often defended against with considerable psychic energy. He might employ various compensatory strategies, adopting an arrogant, dismissive, or condescending attitude towards feeling, art, spirituality, relational concerns, or psychological introspection, thereby devaluing the very qualities he unconsciously feels deficient in. That's all just weak, irrational, unimportant stuff. He might construct and rigidly maintain an exaggeratedly tough, invulnerable hypermasculine persona, emphasizing physical strength, emotional stoicism, aggressive competitiveness, or displays of dominance and control, all designed to mask his underlying feelings of vulnerability, inadequacy, or neediness. His drive for external success, career advancement, wealth accumulation, status acquisition, might become relentless and compulsive, fueled less by healthy ambition or genuine passion and more by a desperate, ongoing need to prove his worth, validate his existence, and stave off the terrifying encounter with his inner sense of lack. Conversely, this hidden inferiority might manifest in a seemingly contradictory pattern, a secret, often unconscious dependency on female approval and validation. He might constantly seek reassurance, admiration, praise, or nurturing care from women to temporarily fill the inner void left by his own disconnected anima, even while consciously maintaining an outward attitude of masculine independence, self-sufficiency, or even superiority. This painful internal conflict, consciously devaluing or defending against the very qualities associated with the anima that he unconsciously feels inferior about and secretly craves external validation for, creates chronic psychological tension, fuels significant resentment, often projected onto women for either possessing these qualities or failing to provide adequate validation, and underlies many self-defeating behaviors, relational failures, and compensatory addictions. Finally, and perhaps most poignantly capturing the existential essence of the anima, wound a profound and pervasive lack of genuine vitality, intrinsic joy, and a felt sense of meaning often permeates the life of the man, significantly disconnected from his soul image regardless of his external circumstances or achievements. He may function with remarkable efficiency, navigate the world with competence, build an impressive career, accumulate significant wealth, maintain socially acceptable relationships, and diligently fulfill all the roles expected of him by society. Yet deep within there persists a chilling flatness, an existential emptiness, a sense that he is merely going through the motions, an actor flawlessly performing a script in a play that feels fundamentally alien, hollow, and devoid of personal significance. Pleasures seem superficial, providing only fleeting distraction rather than deep, resonant nourishment. Achievements once attained feel strangely hollow, failing to deliver the anticipated sense of lasting satisfaction, fulfillment, or intrinsic worth. Relationships, even seemingly close ones with family or partners, may feel primarily functional, obligatory, or lacking in genuine emotional depth, soulful connection, and vitalizing energy. Work becomes a relentless duty, a competitive arena, or simply a means to an end. Money, status, rather than a source of authentic passion, creative engagement, or meaningful contribution. The anima, as Jung understood her, is the vital link to the libido, not just sexual energy, but the fundamental life force itself. The psychic energy that infuses experience with richness, color, intensity, numinosity, wonder, and intrinsic value. When this connection is weak, severed, or operating only unconsciously through distorted channels, life can become a gray, monochrome landscape, technically functional perhaps, but psychically barren, emotionally sterile, and devoid of palpable soul. The man may desperately, often unconsciously, try to combat this inner deadness, this profound existential emptiness, through various forms of external stimulation. The relentless pursuit of novelty, adrenaline-fueled risk-taking, compulsive workaholism that leaves no room for reflection, addictions to substances, sex, gambling, technology, or consumerism, or the constant seeking of external validation and admiration. But these serve only as temporary palliatives, frantic attempts to artificially generate feelings of intensity or fill the gaping inner void. They ultimately fail to address the underlying spiritual and psychological starvation because the source of the problem is internal. The profound tragic alienation from the life-giving meaning-making principle embodied by the neglected, repressed, and often deeply wounded anima. These diverse and often perplexing symptoms, ranging from volatile moods and possessive anxieties to intellectualized negativity, hidden feelings of inferiority, and a pervasive lack of vitality, are not merely isolated character defects or random psychological glitches. They are intricately interconnected manifestations of a single core psychic imbalance, the repression, neglect, and consequent unconscious, often negative possession by the indispensable anima archetype. They represent the painful, often distorted, yet ultimately meaningful cries of a soul, unheard signals, urgently demanding recognition, understanding, and integration. To approach these symptoms with judgment, dismissal, or attempts at mere suppression is to profoundly miss their deeper diagnostic significance and perpetuate the cycle of suffering. To recognize them instead with compassionate awareness as manifestations of the wounded, inner feminine principle, desperately seeking conscious relationship, is to open the crucial first pathway towards understanding, empathy, self-awareness, and ultimately towards exploring the powerful, often perilous dynamics of projection through which this complex inner drama inevitably spills onto the larger stage of external relationships, profoundly shaping attraction, intimacy, conflict, and the potential for both devastating heartbreak and transformative growth. The inner landscape of a man significantly disconnected from his anima, a territory often marked by emotional deserts, underdeveloped relational capacities, stifled intuition, and a pervasive sense of psychic incompletion, rarely remains a hermetically sealed, purely internal affair. The potent, unintegrated, and often highly charged energy associated with the unconscious feminine principle, denied direct expression and integration within his own psyche, inevitably seeks an external object, a living screen onto which it can be projected. This fundamental psychological mechanism, which Carl Jung identified, meticulously explored, and termed anima projection, stands as perhaps the most powerful, pervasive, universally experienced, and often perilous force, shaping masculine romantic desire, relationship dynamics, artistic inspiration, the muse, and the recurring, often tragic cycles of ecstatic idealization, followed by crushing, bitter disillusionment that define the relational histories of countless men. When a man remains largely unconscious of his own inner feminine counterpart, his psyche automatically, compulsively, and often with overwhelming force casts the complex, multifaceted image of his soul, replete with her idealized potentials for connection and nurturance, her shadowy depths, representing feared or rejected aspects of the feminine, her accumulated unmet longings for relationship and meaning, her specific developmental stage reflecting his own inner work, or lack thereof, and imbued with the numinous, compelling power of the archetype itself, onto an actual woman, or sometimes symbolically onto other objects or pursuits, in his external world. In this profound act of unconscious psychic externalization, the real flesh and blood woman becomes obscured, veiled, fundamentally misperceived behind this shimmering, potent, often blindingly bright or ominously dark projected image. She ceases to be seen and related to primarily as herself, a distinct, autonomous, complex individual with her own unique history, needs, desires, flaws, and inner world. She becomes within the man's operative psychic reality, the living embodiment of his lost connection to Eros, the seemingly external key to unlocking his own inner kingdom, the fantasized missing half required for his perceived wholeness, the potential savior figure promising redemption from his inner emptiness. Or conversely, the feared femme fatale threatening engulfment or destruction. This dynamic, Jung asserted with profound insight, lies at the very heart of much of what our culture romanticizes as passionate love-consuming infatuation, destined soulmate connections, obsessive artistic devotion, and tragically also underlies the seemingly inexplicable intensity of possessiveness, jealousy, control, misogyny, and the devastating pain experienced when these projection-fueled relationships inevitably encounter the unyielding friction of reality. Understanding the intricate workings of anima projection is absolutely essential to unraveling the perplexing mysteries of dangerous attraction, the magnetic pull towards seemingly incompatible or even destructive partners, the persistent, often lifelong search for the elusive perfect woman or soulmate, and the ultimately futile chase after an externalized, objectified fragment of one's own unacknowledged, unintegrated soul. The very genesis of intense romantic attraction, that electrifying, often disorienting experience commonly described as falling in love, being instantly captivated, feeling swept off one's feet, experiencing an undeniable chemistry, or believing in love at first sight, is frequently, according to Jung's depth, psychological perspective, ignited and overwhelmingly fueled by this powerful mechanism of anima projection. The man encounters a woman who, through a unique and often unconsciously perceived constellation of her actual characteristics, perhaps her physical appearance resonates with an inner image, her personality embodies traits he lacks, her emotional expression seems particularly vital, her demeanor, her context, or even subtle resemblances to significant female figures from his past, most notably the powerful imprint of the mother complex, which often forms the initial, deeply influential layer upon which the anima archetype is constellated, serves as an effective and often irresistible hook upon which his waiting, often unconsciously charged, and yearning anima image can be hung. She might possess qualities, perhaps a vibrant emotional expressiveness that contrasts starkly with his own habitual reserve, an intuitive wisdom that fascinates his predominantly logical mind, a captivating creativity or artistic sensibility that awakens his own dormant potential, an earthy groundedness and connection to life that speaks to his feelings of alienation, an ethereal mystique that promises access to spiritual depths, or even a perceived vulnerability or neediness that activates his protective instincts or resonates with his own disowned fragility, that unconsciously represent his underdeveloped, repressed, or longed-for anima potential. Alternatively, the critical factor might simply be the timing. He might be navigating a period of significant life transition, a career change, a move, a loss, experiencing profound inner emptiness or creative stagnation, or feeling particularly disconnected and lonely, rendering his psyche psychically primed, exceptionally receptive, and desperately searching for an external figure who seems to promise wholeness, connection, meaning, and escape from his inner state. In that charged moment of encounter, a profound, though entirely unconscious alchemical transformation occurs within his perception. He is no longer simply seeing a woman, an interesting or attractive individual among many others. He is experiencing what feels like an epiphany, the startling, numinous manifestation of the woman, his own soul image made suddenly visible, tangible, seemingly attainable in the external world. He sees her, the anima, apparently embodied before him, carrying the projection of everything his soul lacks and desperately desires. This potent act of projection instantly imbues the woman with an extraordinary numinosity, a captivating aura, a shimmering glow that seems almost supernatural, setting her utterly apart from all other human beings. The attraction feels overwhelming, involuntary, often described using the compelling language of fate, destiny, inescapable magnetism, or cosmic alignment. He experiences feelings of an intensity that can be both exhilarating and terrifying, adoration bordering on worship, obsessive fascination that consumes his thoughts, profound reverence for her perceived qualities, an almost painful visceral longing for union and proximity, and a startling, often illusory sense of deep recognition. I feel like I've known you my whole life. You understand me completely. You're the missing piece I've been searching for. This powerful feeling of having come home or found his missing half feels utterly authentic and profoundly real, because from a psychological standpoint, he is encountering a vital, significant, previously lost or disowned part of his own psyche. His anima, albeit externalized and mistakenly located in the figure of the other person. The sheer energetic charge, the intoxicating quality of this initial phase, often misidentified by both participants as the irrefutable proof of deep, true love or soulmate connection, is largely fueled by the activation and powerful projection of the anima archetype itself, carrying millennia of accumulated human longing for connection and hololocation. He is, in essence, falling headlong into an intense, compelling, and potentially perilous love affair, not primarily with the actual woman standing before him, but with the projected, idealized image of his own unconscious soul. During the ensuing idealization phase, which can vary greatly in duration, depending on the strength of the initial projection, the nature of the individuals involved, and the degree of real-world interaction that challenges the fantasy, the man's perception remains profoundly selective, filtered through the powerful, often rose-tinted or archetypally luminous lens of the projected anima. He focuses almost exclusively on those aspects of the woman, her qualities, her behaviors, even her physical appearance, that perfectly align with his specific, often unconscious soul image, frequently magnifying these positive traits far beyond their actual proportions while remaining conveniently defensively blind to contradictory evidence. He unconsciously overlooks, minimizes, rationalizes away excuses, or simply fails to register her flaws, inconsistencies, limitations, shadow aspects, or any behavior that threatens to disrupt the integrity of the idealized picture he has projected onto her. Depending on the specific content and developmental stage of his personal anima complex, is she the pure, innocent, vulnerable maiden needing his protection and guidance, reflecting perhaps an underdeveloped passive anima? Is she the unconditionally nurturing, all-providing great mother, promising endless comfort and security, often linked to an unresolved mother complex? Is she the inspiring, intellectually stimulating, creatively fertile muse who will ignite his own genius, projecting his own dormant potential? Is she the dangerously alluring, mysterious, sexually captivating femme fatale, offering ecstatic union but threatening dissolution, often carrying his projected shadow desires and fears? Or is she the wise, spiritually profound, guiding Sophia figure promising enlightenment and ultimate meaning, reflecting a more mature but still externalized soul longing? He unconsciously casts the woman in that specific archetypal role. He then proceeds to interact with her, and more importantly, expect her to behave according to the often rigid and demanding script dictated by that particular projection. He implicitly and sometimes explicitly invests her with the immense superhuman power to heal his deepest psychic wounds, fulfill his most profound relational and emotional needs, ignite his dormant creativity, provide unwavering validation and support, rescue him from his own perceived inadequacies or life's difficulties, and ultimately grant him access to the very soulfulness, meaning, and sense of completion he feels lacking within himself. This places an extraordinary, unspoken, unsustainable, and ultimately crushing psychological burden upon the real woman who is required not merely to be herself, with her own evolving needs and complexities, but to flawlessly and continuously embody an archetype, to live up to the static perfection and immense power of his inner fantasy. The relationship therefore unfolds not as a dynamic reciprocal interaction between two complex growing individuals, learning to navigate their authentic connection, but predominantly as the man's ongoing unconscious dialogue with his own projected soul, utilizing the unwitting, often eventually burdened and depleted figure of the woman as a living, breathing, yet ultimately inadequate and inevitably disappointing screen for his internal drama. However, the very nature of psychological projection dictates its inherent instability and eventual dissolution when confronted with the irreducible complexity of lived reality. Projections are psychic veils, shimmering illusions, albeit powerfully felt, ones cast over the often ambiguous, contradictory, and imperfect contours of actual human beings and relationships. And reality, with its inherent messiness, its resistance to simplistic categorization, its insistence on asserting its own autonomous nature, independent of our fantasies, eventually inevitably pushes through the projection's fragile fabric. The disillusionment phase is therefore not a mere possibility or an unfortunate potential outcome in relationships heavily fueled by intense anima projection. It is a psychological inevitability, as the initial romantic fervor necessarily cools with time and familiarity as the couple transitions from the heightened, often performative state of courtship into the more mundane, less idealized rhythms and demands of daily life together, as conflicts inevitably arise from differing needs or perspectives, and as simple proximity and sustained interaction allow for greater, more objective observation. The real woman, with her own distinct personality shaped by her unique history, her autonomous needs and desires often differing from his expectations, her own limitations and imperfections, her own complex inner world, including her shadow aspects, her moments of strength and weakness, rationality and irrationality, begins to emerge inescapably from behind the luminous, idealized projection screen. She acts in ways, perhaps consistently or perhaps just occasionally, that fundamentally diverge from the prescribed anima script he has unconsciously imposed upon her. The nurturing figure might express her own frustration, assert her need for space, or set firm boundaries against his demands. The inspiring muse might reveal mundane concerns, struggle with self-doubt, experience creative blocks, or express opinions that challenge his own. The ethereal soul image proves to have bodily needs, practical limitations, moments of insecurity, or even displays of anger or selfishness. She asserts her own irreducible subjectivity, her own separate, complex, flawed, evolving, and ultimately uncontrollable human reality. For the man still unconsciously ensnared in the powerful grip of the projection, this gradual or sometimes sudden emergence of the real imperfect individual feels like a profound shock, a jarring betrayal, a fundamental violation of the unspoken promise inherent in the initial fantasy. The numinous glow that once surrounded her, the very source of the intoxicating attraction, vanishes, often abruptly replaced by a growing, often bewildered sense of disappointment, irritation, frustration, or even outright anger and profound resentment. "She's not who I thought she was," becomes the recurring internal or external lament, a statement that tragically reveals more about the inaccuracy of his initial perception than about any fundamental change in her character. He fails to grasp the crucial psychological insight that the person he thought she was, the idealized anima figure, the perfect soulmate, the source of his completion, was largely a construct of his own unconscious needs and projections. The perceived change that causes him such distress is occurring primarily within his own perception, as the projection screen cracks, dissolves, or is forcibly torn down by the insistent presence of reality, revealing the stark, often uncomfortable, and deeply challenging gap between his internal soul image and the actual external human being. He is in effect experiencing the painful, often ego-wounding withdrawal of his own projected soul energy from her, and this deeply unsettling internal psychic event, the collapse of his fantasy, is frequently misinterpreted externally as her failure, her inadequacy, her inconsistency, or even her malicious deception. His idealized Anima has seemingly abandoned him, failed to live up to her divine potential, and he unconsciously, often vehemently blames the external woman for this profound inner loss. This confrontation with his own psychological reality, the man's reaction to this critical, often painful juncture of disillusionment, is pivotal, determining whether the experience becomes a catalyst for potential psychological growth and self-awareness, or merely serves to perpetuate a destructive, repetitive relational cycle. Feeling wounded, let down, perhaps deeply angered or even enraged by the perceived failure of the woman to sustain his projected fantasy and fulfill his unconscious demands, he might react by becoming intensely critical, relentlessly judgmental, and attempting to exert control. He may now focus obsessively on her newly perceived flaws, often the very human qualities, imperfections, or needs that were conveniently obscured by his initial idealization, constantly comparing her unfavorably to the impossible standard of his projected Anima. He might try through various means: subtle emotional manipulation, guilt-tripping, withholding affection, playing the victim, overt demands and ultimatums, angry outbursts designed to intimidate, or persistent criticism aimed at undermining her confidence, to coerce her back into the confining mold of his inner image, punishing her implicitly or explicitly for her failure to embody his fantasy. This dynamic creates a toxic relationship environment characterized by constant judgment, escalating conflict, power struggles, erosion of trust, simmering resentment, and profound emotional unsafety for both partners, ultimately destroying any remaining possibility of authentic connection, mutual respect, or shared growth. He clings desperately to the remnants of the projection, refusing to engage with her authentic reality because doing so would necessitate confronting the painful collapse of his own cherished illusion and undertaking the difficult, often ego-deflating inner work that this disillusionment demands. Alternatively, the experience of disillusionment might trigger emotional or physical withdrawal, either gradual or abrupt, feeling that the essential magic has irrevocably vanished, perceiving the profound connection as irretrievably lost because the projection, the source of that initial intensity, has faded. The man might become distant, cold, unresponsive, emotionally unavailable, or simply lose fundamental interest in the relationship and the person. He may grieve the loss of the initial intoxicating fantasy, the feeling of wholeness, excitement, and meaning she seemed to provide, but find himself unwilling or unable to invest the necessary emotional energy, vulnerability, patience, and acceptance required to build a genuine, sustainable relationship with the real, complex, flawed individual who remains after the projection has dissolved. The relationship either ends explicitly, often leaving the woman feeling bewildered, used, and abandoned without fully understanding the unconscious dynamics at play, or it persists as a hollow shell, a functional arrangement perhaps maintained for practical reasons, children, finances, social appearances, but utterly devoid of genuine intimacy, passion, shared vulnerability, soulful connection, or vitalizing energy, haunted forever by the ghost of the initial, unsustainable projection. Very commonly, particularly for men who remain deeply unconscious of the projection mechanism, the reaction to disillusionment is to terminate the relationship, and immediately, often compulsively, and without adequate reflection, restart the search for a new, presumably more perfect projection screen. Convinced that this particular woman was simply a mistake, a flawed vessel constitutionally incapable of adequately carrying the immense weight and radiating the required luminosity of his soul image, he re-enters the relational field, his unexamined, often wounded anima complex still firmly intact and dictating his attractions. He unconsciously scans the horizon, seeking the next woman whose specific qualities or circumstances might momentarily ignite the spark of projection, allowing him to restart the intoxicating but ultimately doomed cycle of intense idealization and inevitable disillusionment. He becomes trapped in a painful, repetitive, compulsive quest for external salvation, forever chasing the elusive, perfect woman, the idealized soulmate, mistaking the intensity of initial projection for the depth of true love and fleeing or blaming when reality inevitably intrudes upon the fantasy. He remains ensnared in an external search for the wholeness, connection, and meaning that can only truly sustainably be found through the arduous introspective work of confronting, understanding, and integrating the anima within his own psyche. He perpetually chases his soul out there in the endlessly shifting figures of the feminine, never realizing that the true destination of his quest lies hidden within the unexplored territories of his own inner world. It is also essential once again to acknowledge the powerful and often insidious dynamic of negative anima projection. In this scenario, the man projects not idealized expectations, but rather the dark, feared, despised, or primitive aspects historically associated with the feminine archetype. Qualities often stemming from his own unresolved negative experiences with his personal mother, the devouring, controlling, or emotionally engulfing mother complex, or fueled by deeply ingrained cultural misogyny and patriarchal anxieties about female power. He might perceive women, either specific individuals he encounters, or women in general as a category, as inherently manipulative, dangerously seductive, the femme fatale, emotionally chaotic and irrational, inherently weak or dependent, suffocatingly needy, untrustworthy, or threateningly powerful, in ways that seem emasculating. This negative projection then fundamentally shapes his perceptions and interactions. He might find himself unconsciously drawn to women who seem to confirm these negative expectations, creating self-fulfilling prophecies through his own behavior or selective perception. Alternatively, he might behave towards women in ways controlling, dismissive, contemptuous, aggressive, emotionally withholding, that actively provoke negative reactions which then appear to justify his pre-existing negative view. His relationships, particularly with intimate partners, become fraught battlegrounds, where he is constantly fighting against his own inner feared, rejected, or underdeveloped feminine qualities by attacking, controlling, devaluing, or attempting to dominate their external representatives. The intensity of his negativity, his suspicion, his misogyny, or his need to control is often directly proportional to the depth of his own unreconciled anima issues and his profound terror of confronting these challenging aspects within the darkness of his own psyche. Living under the pervasive influence of anima projection, whether it manifests primarily through the intoxicating heights of overwhelming idealization or through the corrosive depths of negativity and misogyny, fundamentally prevents the development of mature, authentic, reality-based relationships, grounded in mutual recognition, respect, and acceptance of two separate whole individuals. It keeps the man locked in a state of psychological immaturity and profound dependency, perpetually reliant on external figures to embody or contain essential unintegrated parts of his own psyche. Either the idealized soul he cannot access within or the feared darkness he cannot confront. It fuels endless, often bewildering cycles of misunderstanding, conflict, heartbreak, relational dysfunction, and deep psychic suffering, causing significant pain not only to himself, but often far more profoundly and unjustly to the women who become entangled in the complex, often invisible web of his unconscious projections. Most significantly, from the critical perspective of his own psychological development and journey towards wholeness, Anima projection serves as a formidable, often insurmountable obstacle to the essential process of individuation. As long as his primary psychic energy, his libido, remains fixated on finding, fixing, managing, controlling, idealizing, devaluing, or fighting the external anima carrier, the crucial, necessary, challenging, yet ultimately liberating inner work of acknowledging, differentiating, confronting, understanding, and consciously integrating his own complex, multifaceted anima reality remains tragically unaddressed, leaving him psychically incomplete, relationally immature, and vulnerable to repeating the same painful, soul-denying patterns indefinitely throughout his life. Recognizing the subtle yet powerful signature patterns of anima projection, the disproportionate intensity of initial feeling, the rapid swings between idealization and devaluation, the compelling sense of inescapable fate, the initial blindness to flaws followed by an obsessive focus on them, the recurring nature of relational patterns across different partners, requires significant courage, unflinching self-honesty, and often dedicated self-awareness practices. It is, however, the indispensable first step towards breaking free from this futile, often destructive external chase and finally embarking on the authentic, challenging, yet profoundly rewarding inner journey towards reclaiming and integrating one's own soul. While our exploration has necessarily delved into the often shadowed and troubled landscape resulting from anima repression, possession, and unconscious projection, illuminating the significant psychological distress, relational chaos, and existential emptiness that frequently arise from this profound disconnection, it is absolutely vital now to turn our gaze towards the immense life-affirming potential, the radiant possibilities inherent in the journey of anima integration. Carl Jung's profound psychological framework was never merely a catalog of pathologies. It was fundamentally a map towards wholeness, Ganzheit, a guide for the arduous yet ultimately deeply rewarding process of individuation. He passionately believed, based on his extensive clinical experience and his own courageous inner explorations, that by consciously acknowledging the existence and value of the inner feminine principle, by patiently differentiating her influence from the dictates of the ego and the grip of unconscious complexes, and by diligently cultivating an ongoing, dynamic, respectful, and conscious relationship with her, a man could unlock previously dormant or inaccessible dimensions of his being. This integrative process leads not to a diminution or weakening of masculinity, as cultural stereotypes and ingrained fears might suggest, but rather to its profound completion, maturation, and humanization. The integrated anima ceases to function as an unconscious saboteur, fueling perplexing moods or destructive projections onto others. Instead, she transforms into an invaluable inner ally, a trusted guide navigating the complex terrain of the soul, a deep wellspring of creativity and intuitive insight, a skilled facilitator of emotional wisdom and profound empathy, a stable foundation for genuine intimacy and satisfying connection, and a vital conduit connecting the conscious personality to the very soul of existence, infusing life with meaning, vitality, and depth. Achieving a conscious partnership with the anima represents a monumental achievement in the individuation process, yielding psychological treasures that enrich every facet of a man's life and contribute to a more balanced and integrated way of being in the world. What then are the tangible hallmarks, the lived realities, the psychological treasures bestowed by this hard-won state of anima integration. How does the inner landscape shift, and how consequently does the man's engagement with himself, with others, and with the world fundamentally transform as he cultivates a more conscious and harmonious relationship with his soul image? The changes are typically multifaceted, often unfolding gradually, yet leading to profound and lasting shifts in personality perception and overall well-being. Perhaps the most fundamental and readily observable transformation occurs within the rich and often previously feared territory of his emotional world. The man who once experienced his inner life as either a barren desert of numbness or a volatile landscape prone to unpredictable storms of affect now develops genuine emotional intelligence and profound depth. This is far more sophisticated and integrated than merely learning behavioral techniques to manage or suppress unwanted emotions. Integration signifies the development of a differentiated feeling function. He becomes capable of experiencing the full complex spectrum of human affect, from the soaring heights of joy, love, and creative ecstasy, to the challenging depths of grief, fear, anger, shame, and sorrow. With greater awareness, acceptance, nuance, and conscious mediation, he learns to distinguish subtle shades within broader emotional categories, differentiating, for example, authentic compassion arising from genuine connection from pity rooted in a sense of superiority, or distinguishing righteous anger defending a core value from petty resentment fueled by an injured ego or unconscious envy. He develops the crucial capacity to tolerate emotional ambiguity and paradox, recognizing that feelings are often complex, layered, and even contradictory, without needing to immediately simplify, repress, or prematurely resolve the inner tension. Most importantly, he learns to trust his feelings, not as irrational disruptions to be overcome or hidden, but as vital sources of information about his inner state, his authentic values, the quality and health of his relationships, and his intuitive response to the complexities of life. He can consciously hold difficult or painful emotions, allowing them to be processed, understood, and integrated, extracting their inherent wisdom and potential for growth, rather than being unconsciously driven, paralyzed, or forced into destructive acting out by them. This newfound emotional literacy, maturity, and conscious relationship with feeling naturally fosters profound empathy. He becomes capable of genuinely sensing, understanding, resonating with, and responding with compassion to the emotional experiences of others, moving beyond intellectual analysis or projected assumptions to achieve true heart-to-heart connection. This capacity becomes the absolute bedrock of authentic human intimacy, transforming his relationships, allowing for deeper trust, mutual understanding, and emotionally resonant connection. His feeling function, once a repressed and potentially dangerous force, operating autonomously from the shadow, becomes a refined, reliable, consciously accessible instrument of perception, connection, ethical discernment, and wise judgment, working in harmonious, dynamic collaboration with his rational mind, logos, rather than in perpetual opposition or unconscious sabotage. Secondly, the conscious dialogue with and integration of the anima acts as a powerful and often surprising catalyst, unlocking deep reservoirs of creativity, imagination, and intuitive potential. As the archetypal bridge connecting the conscious ego to the imaginal, symbolic, and pattern-rich realm of the unconscious, the anima provides direct access to the very wellspring of inspiration. The man engaged in this integrative process may find his creativity blossoming, often in unexpected ways. This creativity is not necessarily confined to traditional artistic disciplines like painting, writing, music, or performance, though these often flourish significantly, but can permeate all aspects of his life. His thinking becomes less rigid and linear, more associative, flexible, and capable of metaphorical leaps and synthesizing disparate ideas into novel wholes. He might approach problem-solving in his work with greater innovation and insight, find more imaginative and empathetic solutions in his relationships, develop a more visionary style of leadership, or simply perceive the world around him with a heightened sense of wonder, beauty, symbolic resonance, and underlying interconnectedness. The creative process itself often becomes more fluid, less effortful, feeling more like a collaboration with an inner source, a receptive listening for what wants to emerge from the depths, rather than solely a strenuous act of conscious will and deliberate construction. Concurrently, his intuition, previously dismissed as unreliable, feared as irrational, or simply inaccessible due to the dominance of logos, emerges as a trusted and valuable cognitive faculty, complementing and enriching his rational analysis. He learns to recognize, differentiate, respect, and appropriately utilize those gut feelings, subtle inner knowings, synchronicities, symbolic dream images, and sudden insights that seem to arise from a source beyond immediate conscious reasoning. He understands that intuition is not mere guesswork or wishful thinking, but a sophisticated form of holistic pattern recognition, drawing upon the vast processing capabilities of the unconscious. He learns to integrate intuitive knowing with logical analysis, leading to more holistic, nuanced, often wiser, and ultimately more effective decision-making, particularly when navigating complex, ambiguous, or rapidly changing situations where purely rational data is insufficient or unavailable. This powerful synergy between a well-developed rationality, logos, and an awakened, consciously related to capacity for intuition and feeling, eros, mediated by the integrated anima, results in a more complete, adaptable, insightful, and potent form of intelligence capable of generating breakthroughs and navigating life's complexities with greater depth and effectiveness. Thirdly, and perhaps most consequentially, for his experience of human connection and belonging, anima integration fundamentally reshapes and profoundly deepens a man's capacity for authentic, meaningful, mutually enriching, and sustainable relationships. The crucial, often difficult step of consciously withdrawing the distorting veils of anima projection clears the perceptual field, allowing him finally, perhaps for the first time, to truly see and engage with the women in his life, and indeed all individuals, as they actually are. Separate, complex, evolving human beings possessing their own unique subjectivities, their own inner worlds, their own distinct constellation of strengths, weaknesses, needs, desires, histories, and limitations. Rather than relating to them primarily as archetypal figures, idealized saviors, feared destroyers, or convenient screens for his own unconscious needs, unresolved complexes, or projected soul image, the compulsive, often destructive cycles of intense idealization, inevitably followed by bitter devaluation, begin to subside, replaced by a more realistic, compassionate, and enduring form of connection, because he is actively cultivating the eros principle, the capacity for feeling relatedness, empathy, vulnerability, and authentic connection. Within himself, he becomes significantly less psychologically dependent on finding these essential qualities exclusively or perfectly embodied in an external partner. This fosters relationships built upon a foundation of genuine mutuality, shared reality, reciprocal understanding, authentic emotional exchange, and mutual respect for individual autonomy, rather than dynamics rooted in unconscious need fulfillment, compensatory projection, possessive control, archetypal entanglement, or power struggles. He develops the capacity for true intimacy, which inherently requires the courage to be authentically vulnerable, the ability to offer genuine non-possessive empathy, the skill to navigate conflict constructively, through open, honest dialogue that honors both perspectives and the maturity to embrace and honor both the profound connection and the necessary separateness inherent in any healthy relationship. His possessiveness, born of inner insecurity, transforms into trust and genuine appreciation for his partner's autonomy. His fear of emotional engulfment or abandonment lessens significantly as his own inner center strengthens through integration. His intimate relationships, particularly his primary partnership, cease being primarily arenas for playing out unconscious psychological dramas or seeking external completion and become, instead, fertile supportive ground for profound mutual growth, shared discovery, deep companionship, resilient love, and enduring soulful connection. He learns the challenging but rewarding art of loving the real person imperfections, and all finding richness and depth in the complexity and authenticity of the connection, rather than perpetually chasing an unsustainable idealized fantasy. Fourthly, the introspective journey inward towards integrating the anima invariably fosters a vital and often profoundly healing reconnection with life's embodied realities and the deep wisdom inherent in the natural world. The prevalent modern tendency towards hyper-intellectualism, abstraction, and a functional dissociation from the physical body, often exacerbated by technologies that keep us in our heads and disconnected from sensory experience, begins to heal as the man integrates the anima, who is intrinsically linked archetypally to the earth instinct, cyclical rhythms, and somatic experience. He develops greater embodied awareness, learning not just to inhabit his physical self more fully, but to listen attentively and respectfully to its subtle wisdom conveyed through physical sensations, gut feelings, energy levels, intuitive bodily responses to situations or people, and the somatic resonance of emotional states. He learns to trust the body not just as a biological machine to be maintained or optimized, but as an intelligent partner in perception and knowing, a source of grounding vitality and crucial feedback from the unconscious. This often leads to improved physical health choices driven by inner attunement rather than external rules, and a greater sense of overall well-being. Simultaneously, his relationship with the natural world frequently undergoes a profound deepening and transformation. He moves beyond viewing nature merely as a collection of resources to be exploited, a challenging landscape to be conquered, a scientific object to be analyzed, or an aesthetically pleasing backdrop for human activities. Instead, he begins to experience nature as a living, interconnected presence, a source of solace, profound beauty, humbling power, symbolic meaning, spiritual nourishment, and a deep sense of kinship and belonging within the larger ecological web of life. This ecological consciousness, intrinsically rooted in the eros principle of relatedness and often mediated by the anima, serves as a powerful antidote to the alienation, anthropocentrism, and destructive hubris inherent in much of modern industrial culture. It fosters a sense of reverence, responsibility, and participation, reminding him of the fundamental cyclical realities of existence: birth, growth, decay, death, renewal, which the integrated anima helps the conscious psyche to accept, embrace, and find profound meaning within. This grounded connection to both his own body and the larger body of the earth provides essential psychic ballast for the ego, preventing dangerous inflation, fostering humility, and keeping the man tethered to the fundamental, undeniable truths of embodied finite existence. Fifthly, the man who consciously cultivates a dynamic relationship with his anima develops significantly greater psychological resilience, adaptability, inner flexibility, and capacity to navigate complexity. He is no longer rigidly confined within the often brittle defenses and limiting perspectives of a narrow, culturally prescribed masculine persona. Having courageously acknowledged and begun the ongoing, lifelong process of integrating challenging aspects of his shadow, work that is often deeply intertwined with Anima integration, as she frequently carries the disowned feeling, vulnerability, relational needs, or creative impulses relegated to the shadow. And having consciously developed access to and trust in his feeling and intuitive functions, alongside his established thinking and sensation capacities, he possesses a much broader, more nuanced, more complete, and therefore more adaptable psychological repertoire. He can respond to life's inevitable challenges, unforeseen changes, painful losses, interpersonal conflicts, and existential uncertainties with greater equanimity, resourcefulness, creativity, and wisdom. He is less likely to be destabilized, shattered, or thrown into prolonged crisis by adversity, because his sense of self is rooted in a deeper, more integrated, more resilient psychic foundation that encompasses both conscious and unconscious realities. He develops through practice and integration the crucial capacity Jung termed the transcendent function, the remarkable ability of the psyche to consciously hold the tension between opposing psychic forces, such as logic versus feeling, autonomy versus connection, conscious intention versus unconscious resistance, masculine versus feminine principles within, without prematurely collapsing into one pole, defensively rejecting the other, or seeking facile compromises. This conscious holding of tension allows for the emergence of a new synthesizing perspective, a creative solution, or a more integrated state of being that transcends the initial opposition. This inner flexibility makes him more adaptable to change, more creative in his problem solving, more capable of understanding different perspectives, and ultimately more psychologically robust and resilient in the face of life's inherent paradoxes and complexities. His personality becomes less like rigid, easily shattered armor, and more like a strong, flexible, deeply rooted tree, capable of bending in the winds of change without breaking, drawing nourishment from both the earth below, unconscious, and the sky above, consciousness. Finally, and perhaps representing the culminating synthesis and deepest reward of this entire transformative process, Anima integration leads towards the discovery, cultivation, and living expression of authentic soul-rooted meaning and purpose in life. The gnawing existential emptiness, the pervasive sense of futility or disconnection that often haunts the man, living predominantly from an isolated, hyper-rational, soul-disconnected ego, begins gradually to dissipate. This inner void is filled not by the fleeting distractions of external gratifications, the endless pursuit of conventional success markers, or the addictive quest for power and status, but by a growing, palpable connection to his own inner depths, his unique soul signature, his intrinsic values, and his participation in something larger and more profound than his individual ego concerns. He starts to discern, often through intuition, dreams and synchronicities mediated by the anima, a sense of personal calling, a feeling of alignment with a purpose that resonates at the core of his being. His life choices become guided less by external societal pressures, ingrained parental complexes, compensatory drives stemming from insecurity or the need for approval, and more by an internal compass attuned to the subtle but clear guidance of his soul, to what genuinely nourishes his wholeness, fosters his ongoing growth towards the self, and allows him to contribute his unique gifts meaningfully and authentically to the world. This doesn't necessarily entail abandoning worldly responsibilities, career ambitions, or practical concerns, but rather infusing these external pursuits with a quality of purpose, integrity, depth, and soulfulness that arises fundamentally from within. Life ceases to feel like a series of disconnected problems to be solved, battles to be won, or roles to be dutifully performed according to an external script. It becomes instead a meaningful, unfolding journey, of becoming guided by the integrated wisdom emerging from the ongoing dynamic dialogue between his conscious ego and his reclaimed, respected, and consciously related to soul image, the anima. This integrated state doesn't promise perpetual happiness or a life free from pain, suffering, or struggle. Rather, it offers the profound gift of experiencing those inherent human difficulties within a larger framework of personal meaning, archetypal significance, and participation in the deep, mysterious, often paradoxical, yet ultimately purposeful unfolding of the self. This is the immense power, the profound gift, the deep humanization offered by the conscious integration of the anima, a transformation that heals not only the psychological wounds of the individual man, but holds the vital potential to contribute significantly to a more balanced, compassionate, interconnected, and soulful world for all. Acknowledging the profound significance of the anima, understanding the detrimental consequences of her neglect, and envisioning the transformative power of her integration represent crucial stages of awareness. However, awareness alone, while necessary, is insufficient for genuine psychological change. The vital question then becomes practical. How does a man, often deeply entrenched in cultural conditioning and personal defenses that have historically marginalized or repressed his inner feminine principle, actually embark on the tangible lived journey of cultivating a conscious, respectful, and dynamic relationship with his soul image? This is not a quest for a quick fix, a weekend enlightenment, or a simple adherence to a prescribed formula for the path of individuation. As Jung consistently emphasized, is profoundly unique to each individual, unfolding according to its own inner timing and symbolic logic. Yet, drawing from his own courageous descent into the unconscious, documented profoundly in works like the Red Book, and distilled from his decades of meticulous clinical work guiding countless others through their inner landscapes, Jung illuminated several core principles, essential attitudes, and practical approaches that can serve as reliable compass points, trusted tools, and supportive containers for navigating this often challenging, sometimes disorienting, yet ultimately deeply rewarding inner pilgrimage towards anima integration and psychological wholeness. These methods are fundamentally about fostering dialogue, building bridges across the conscious-unconscious divide, and creating the receptive conditions necessary for the often shy, sometimes wounded, yet inherently wise anima to emerge from the shadows, share her unique perspective, heal from the injuries of past neglect, and contribute her vital balancing energies to the conscious personality, thereby fostering greater integration, resilience, creativity, and soulful meaning in a man's life. The absolute non-negotiable foundation upon which this entire endeavor rests, the fertile ground from which all genuine inner work must spring, lies in the conscious cultivation of a specific inner attitude. This involves a deliberate, often effortful shift away from the ego's habitual modes of operation when confronted with the unknown or the seemingly irrational. Its tendency towards immediate control, categorical analysis, dismissive judgment, reductionistic explanation, and inherent fear of that which lies beyond its current understanding. Instead, the journey requires embracing qualities often symbolically associated with the feminine principle itself, yet universally essential for any authentic engagement with the depths of the psyche: receptivity, a willingness to listen deeply without preconceived notions, genuine curiosity, and open-hearted interest in understanding the nature and messages of inner experience. Profound patience, recognizing that deep psychological processes unfold according to their own organic timing, often slowly and non-linearly. Essential humility, acknowledging the vastness and autonomy of the unconscious and the inherent limitations of the conscious ego's perspective. and deep respect for the inner world as a valid, meaningful, and potentially wise reality, even when its expressions seem paradoxical, disturbing, or contradictory to conscious values. This fundamental shift requires actively challenging the internalized cultural biases and personal defenses that automatically devalue feeling intuition, vulnerability, symbolism, and the non-rational aspects of experience. It means approaching the manifestations of the anima, whether subtle shifts in mood, compelling dream images, intuitive hunches, creative impulses, or even challenging projections in relationships, not as problems to be eradicated, weaknesses to be overcome, or mere noise to be ignored, but as potential communications from a vital, neglected part of oneself, deserving of careful attention, thoughtful consideration, and respectful dialogue. This initial, often difficult adjustment in attitude, moving from habitual dismissal, fear, or control towards sustained, respectful curiosity and openness, creates the indispensable psychic space, the safe inner container necessary for the often shy, sometimes wounded, yet inherently valuable anima to begin revealing herself more clearly and for a meaningful reciprocal dialogue to commence. Without this foundational shift, any techniques employed risk remaining superficial ego exercises, failing to penetrate to the soulful depths where true lasting integration occurs. With this receptive inner attitude established as the grounding orientation, attentive and dedicated dreamwork emerges as one of the most direct, consistently available, and profoundly insightful pathways for encountering and understanding the anima. Dreams arising spontaneously from the unconscious each night offer a direct line of communication, bypassing the ego's censorship and speaking in the psyche's native tongue, the language of symbols, images, and emotionally charged narratives. The anima, as a primary mediator between consciousness and the unconscious, frequently appears in male dreams, personified in a myriad of potent female forms, each carrying specific nuances related to the dreamer's current psychological state and developmental challenges. She might appear as an unknown, alluring young woman representing emerging potential or projected desire, a familiar figure from the past, mother, sister, former lover, carrying unresolved complexes, a powerful, intimidating goddess figure embodying archetypal feminine power, a damsel in distress signaling neglected vulnerability or a need for rescue, often of the anima herself from repression, a wise old woman, crone, offering guidance from the depths or even in non-human forms, imbued with feminine symbolism, e.g., certain animals like cats or snakes, vessels like cups or caves, natural elements like water or the moon. The key to unlocking the dream's message lies not just in remembering the plot or identifying the figures, but in meticulously recording the dream in a journal immediately upon waking, capturing the vivid sensory details, the specific actions and interactions, the overall emotional atmosphere, fear, awe, sadness, joy, confusion, seemingly minor or bizarre elements, and crucially, the dreamer's own feelings and reactions within the dream. This practice honors the communication and creates a rich body of symbolic material for reflection. The next vital step involves moving beyond simplistic, often misleading dictionary-style interpretations towards Jung's preferred method of amplification. This entails exploring the dream images on multiple intersecting levels. What are my unique personal associations with this specific female figure, this particular landscape, this recurring animal, this symbolic object based on my own life history, significant memories, current concerns, and subjective feelings, then broadening the context. How does this symbol or motif appear in wider cultural narratives, in myths from various traditions, in enduring fairy tales, in religious iconography and stories, in alchemical symbolism, in art history, in literature? What archetypal themes might this symbol universally resonate with? E.g., initiation rites themes of sacrifice and redemption, the union of opposites, the journey to the underworld, the quest for the treasure. This layered process of amplification doesn't aim to impose a single definitive meaning onto the dream, but rather seeks to enrich the symbolic context, allowing the dream's multi-layered message, often conveyed through the complex figure of the anima, to unfold its intricate meaning and resonate more profoundly with the dreamer's conscious situation and unconscious dynamics. Paying particular sustained attention to recurring dream themes, dreams, featuring intense emotional encounters with female figures, whether perceived as profoundly positive or deeply threatening, or dreams that leave a lasting numinous impression, a sense of deep significance, awe, or mystery, is especially crucial, as these often signify core anima dynamics, unresolved psychic tensions, or important developmental processes urgently seeking conscious engagement and integration. Treating these dream figures not merely as abstract symbols to be intellectually deciphered, but as potential dialogue partners asking them questions during subsequent reflection, or more powerfully within the practice of active imagination, can transform dreamwork from a passive analytical exercise into an active dynamic relational process, fostering a living connection with the anima, building directly upon the insights, images, and emotional resonances gleaned from dreams. Jung's signature technique of active imagination offers a uniquely powerful method for engaging in direct conscious dialogue with the anima and other autonomous figures or complexes emerging from the unconscious during a waking yet deliberately altered state of consciousness. This is a disciplined practice fundamentally different from passive daydreaming, wishful thinking, or controlled visualization, where the ego dictates the script. It typically begins by consciously creating a safe and protected space and time, free from external interruptions and internal distractions. One then induces a state of relaxed focus, perhaps through mindful breathing, gentle meditation, or simply sitting quietly and allowing the mind's surface chatter to subside. The next step is to bring to mind a starting point, perhaps a potent mood, like the inexplicable melancholy discussed earlier, a compelling image or figure from a recent dream, especially a significant anima figure, a persistent physical sensation carrying emotional charge, a creative block, or even an abstract question directed towards the inner feminine principle. What perspective do you hold on this situation? With gentle, sustained, non-judgmental attention, one allows this starting point to develop autonomously, letting subsequent images, scenes, figures, dialogues, or inner voices emerge spontaneously from the unconscious without consciously trying to direct, control, manipulate, or censor the process. The pivotal defining step is then to engage actively and consciously with whatever arises, adopting the attitude that one is interacting with a separate, autonomous psychic reality. If a figure appears, speak to her, whether internally whispered aloud or written down. Ask her pertinent questions related to her appearance, her actions, or the initial starting point. Who are you and why are you here? What do you represent within my psyche? What message, feeling, or perspective do you need me to understand? Then, crucially, one must shift into a state of deep, receptive listening, patiently waiting for the response, allowing it to unfold in its own authentic form, perhaps as inner words carrying unexpected insights. As further symbolic images shifting the scene, as powerful waves of emotion washing over the body, as distinct bodily sensations arising, or even as sudden intuitive understandings that bypass language entirely. The conscious ego remains present throughout this process, not as a passive observer nor as a controlling director, but as an active participant and witness capable of asking clarifying questions. Can you tell me more about that? Expressing its own reactions honestly. that makes me feel afraid, confused, angry, negotiating potential conflicts. I understand your perspective, but I also need to consider but always fundamentally respecting the autonomy and reality of the unconscious figure or emergent content. This dynamic dialogue fosters crucial differentiation, the ability to recognize the anima's perspective as distinct from though related to the ego's, while simultaneously building a relational bridge across the conscious-unconscious divide. It is highly recommended, almost essential, according to Jung, to objectify the experience by giving it some tangible form, meticulously recording the dialogues in writing, drawing or painting the key images and figures, sculpting them in clay, exploring their essence through improvisational movement or dance, or even finding music that captures the emotional tone. This act of giving form anchors the ephemeral inner encounter in conscious reality, prevents it from dissolving back into the amorphousness of the unconscious, allows for later more objective reflection and analysis, facilitates integration into waking life, and most importantly, honors the profound significance of the inner work. Active imagination, when practiced consistently with courage, sincerity, and appropriate discernment, transforms the anima from an abstract psychological concept, an unconsciously projected force, or a source of disruptive symptoms, into a tangible, dynamic inner reality, a differentiated psychic partner with whom a conscious, evolving, mutually informative, and potentially deeply transformative relationship can be forged over time. Given the anima's intimate and inextricable connection to the often underdeveloped feeling function, eros, in men culturally conditioned towards logos, dominance, consciously and diligently cultivating this capacity is an indispensable, non-negotiable aspect of the integration journey. This is emphatically not about becoming overly emotional, sentimental, or losing rational perspective. Rather, it is about developing emotional literacy, differentiation, conscious awareness, appropriate expression, and the crucial ability to value feeling as a legitimate and vital form of intelligence and guidance. For many men, this requires dedicated, patient, and often courageous effort, as it involves challenging deeply ingrained internal defenses and external cultural prohibitions against male emotional expression and vulnerability. The process typically begins with the fundamental practice of simply learning to notice and name feelings with greater precision and nuance, regularly pausing throughout the day to conduct an inner emotional check-in, asking, what specific emotion am I experiencing right now? And attempting to move beyond generic labels like good, bad, stressed, or fine towards identifying more specific states like disappointment, tenderness, vulnerability, shame, longing, awe, gratitude, remorse, compassion, righteous anger is a foundational exercise in building emotional awareness, learning to identify the subtle physical correlates of emotions, the tightness in the chest accompanying anxiety, the warmth spreading with affection, the knot forming in the stomach indicating fear, the lump rising in the throat signifying grief, helps to anchor feeling, intangible bodily reality, counteracting the tendency towards purely abstract intellectualization, journaling specifically about emotional responses to daily events, interpersonal interactions, dreams, or even creative works, serves as a powerful tool for tracking patterns, understanding triggers, exploring the underlying needs or beliefs associated with certain feelings, and deepening self-awareness regarding one's emotional landscape, engaging consciously with art, music, literature, and nature with an explicit intention to connect with the feelings they evoke, rather than solely analyzing their form, structure, or content, provides invaluable practice in exercising and refining the feeling function in a safe, contained way. Crucially, this developmental process involves learning to value feeling not as an irrational disruption, a sign of weakness, or an inconvenient byproduct of biology, but as a legitimate, vital, and intelligent form of perception and guidance, equal in importance to, though different in nature and function from rational thought. Feelings provide essential information about our values, our needs, the quality of our relationships, our authentic response to life, and the state of our inner world. Learning to listen to this information respectfully without immediate judgment or suppression is key to building a healthier relationship with the anima. This often requires actively challenging deeply ingrained cultural biases against male emotional expression and vulnerability, as well as confronting personal defenses built up over years of repression. Seeking the supportive container of psychotherapy, particularly with a therapist trained in depth psychology, who understands the nuances of feeling development and the importance of integrating Eros, can be instrumental in safely navigating complex, historically repressed, or seemingly overwhelming emotional territory. Learning healthier coping mechanisms and developing a more conscious, differentiated, and integrated feeling function. Learning the intricate, often subtle yet profoundly meaningful language of the heart is, in essence, learning the native tongue of the anima, opening the door to deeper self-understanding and more authentic connection. Creative expression in its myriad forms and regardless of perceived skill level serves as another natural, powerful, and often deeply satisfying language for the anima, providing a vital channel for her energy and perspective to find form and enter conscious awareness. Engaging in activities that prioritize process over product, intuition over logic, symbolic expression over literal representation, and playful exploration over rigid control can become a profound form of active dialogue with the soul image. This might involve painting or drawing spontaneously, allowing colors, shapes, and images to emerge from the unconscious without a preconceived plan or critical judgment. Writing poetry, fiction, or journaling freely, letting words flow from a deeper place, exploring emotional landscapes or symbolic narratives, playing a musical instrument improvisationally, allowing feeling and intuition to guide the sound rather than adhering strictly to a score, engaging in expressive movement or dance that allows the body to communicate non-verbally, sculpting clay or working with other tactile materials in a way that emphasizes sensory experience and emergent form, tending a garden with mindful presence and connection to the life cycle, or even cooking creatively, paying attention to sensory details, intuition, and the nurturing aspect of providing nourishment. The key element across these diverse activities is the attitude of playful exploration and receptive openness to what wants to emerge from the depths, rather than imposing rigid conscious control or focusing solely on achieving a technically perfect or externally validated end product. The creative act itself, the process of giving tangible form to inner impulses, images, and feelings, allows the anima's energy to flow, find expression, and communicate symbolically. The resulting creations, whether a seemingly crude drawing, a fragmented poem, a simple melody, or a lovingly prepared meal, often contain surprising insights, facilitate emotional release, carry compensatory messages that bypass the ego's defenses, and provide invaluable material for self-understanding and further psychological integration in ways that purely verbal or analytical approaches may not be able to reach. It is, in essence, giving the soul a tangible voice, allowing her to speak through the language of form, color, sound, and movement, re-establishing a conscious and respectful connection with nature. And the body provides a direct, non-verbal, yet profoundly effective pathway to grounding the anima work in embodied reality, counteracting the pervasive modern tendency towards disembodiment and alienation from the physical world. The anima, as the principle of life and eros, is intrinsically linked archetypally to the earth, to instinct, to cyclical rhythms, and to the wisdom held within somatic experience. therefore consciously spending unstructured time in natural settings, not merely using nature as a backdrop for exercise or recreation, but truly being with it, observing its intricate details, with quiet attention, attuning to its subtle sounds and scents, feeling its textures, allowing oneself to be moved by its beauty, power, or tranquility, can powerfully reawaken the instinctual sensory connection that the anima mediates. It fosters a sense of belonging, perspective, awe, and participation in a web of life larger than the individual ego. Similarly, engaging in practices that cultivate somatic awareness and body intelligence, such as mindfulness meditation, focusing specifically on bodily sensations, yoga traditions emphasizing the mind-body connection, like hatha or yin yoga, somatic experiencing therapies, tai chi, qigong, Feldenkrais method, authentic movement practices, or even simply learning to pay close, non-judgmental attention to breath patterns, posture, muscle tension, gut feelings, and the physical manifestations of emotional states, helps to bridge the often detrimental mind-body split exacerbated by anima repression and hyper-rationalism. The body often holds emotions, memories, traumas, and intuitive knowledge that the conscious mind ignores, denies, or cannot access through purely intellectual means. Learning to listen respectfully to its subtle language, to trust its intrinsic wisdom, is akin to learning to listen to a crucial aspect of the anima's voice, fostering grounding, integration, and a more holistic sense of self. The arduous but absolutely necessary work of consciously withdrawing anima projections forms a central ongoing pillar of the integration journey. As extensively explored previously, the tendency to unconsciously cast the soul image onto external women is a primary mechanism maintaining anima disconnection and fueling relational dysfunction. Therefore, integration demands developing a keen, often uncomfortable capacity for rigorous self-reflection regarding one's patterns of intense attraction, idealization, possessiveness, jealousy, disappointment, resentment, and conflict within relationships. It requires courageously asking challenging questions. Is the overwhelming intensity of my feeling, whether adoration or rage, truly about this specific person and situation, or might it be significantly amplified by my own unintegrated anima complex? Am I placing unrealistic archetypal expectations upon my partner, expecting her to be my constant source of nurturing inspiration, emotional regulation, or spiritual salvation, qualities I need to cultivate within myself? Can I honestly differentiate the real, complex, flawed human being standing before me from the idealized or demonized inner image I have unconsciously superimposed upon her? What does this recurring pattern of attracting a certain type of partner, leading to similar dynamics and outcomes, reveal about my own unmet needs, my disowned vulnerabilities, my fears of intimacy, or my underdeveloped feeling function? This process of withdrawal is often psychologically painful, involving the relinquishment of cherished romantic fantasies, the confrontation with one's own psychological deficits and immaturities, the acceptance of personal responsibility for one's contribution to relational difficulties, and the often grief-filled acceptance of the partner's separate reality and limitations. However, each successful act of conscious projection withdrawal performs a vital psychological function. It reclaims precious psychic energy, libido, that was previously bound up in the external projection, making this energy available for crucial internal development and the conscious integration of the anima within one's own psyche. It paves the way, gradually but definitively, for more authentic, reality-based, mutually respectful relationships built on genuine connection and mutual recognition, rather than unconscious entanglement and archetypal fantasy. Finally, Jung consistently acknowledged the immense value and often the sheer necessity of supportive external containers for navigating the profound and sometimes destabilizing territory of deep inner work, particularly the encounter with powerful archetypes like the Anima and the Shadow. While the journey of individuation is ultimately a deeply personal and individual undertaking, attempting it in complete isolation can be overwhelming, confusing, and even psychologically risky. Sharing the journey within a safe understanding and appropriately boundaried context can provide crucial support, perspective containment, and mirroring. This might involve working consistently with a skilled Jungian analyst or depth therapist who understands the intricacies of the unconscious, the archetypal landscape, dream interpretation, and the specific challenges of anima integration, providing expert guidance, challenge, and a secure therapeutic relationship. Participating in a well-facilitated men's group, specifically focused on authentic emotional sharing, psychological exploration, and mutual support, can offer invaluable peer reflection, reduce feelings of isolation, and challenge limiting masculine norms. Cultivating conscious relationships with partners, friends, or mentors who are themselves engaged in their own inner work and who understand and support the individuation process can create a supportive relational field that encourages vulnerability, honesty, and mutual growth. These external supports do not do the inner work for the man, but they can provide the necessary safety perspective, containment, encouragement, and reality testing needed to navigate the inevitable difficulties, ambiguities, and emotional intensities of the journey, constructively preventing overwhelm, facilitating integration, and helping him stay grounded while exploring the profound depths of his own psyche. The conscious journey of meeting, understanding, differentiating, and ultimately integrating the anima is therefore not a simple task with a clear endpoint, but rather an ongoing, dynamic, lifelong process of deepening relationship with the soul. It is an intricate dance between the conscious ego and the autonomous unconscious, between the structuring principle of logos and the connecting principle of eros, requiring continuous attention, dialogue, adjustment, and a willingness to embrace paradox and complexity. It involves patiently tending to the inner garden, learning to recognize the anima's diverse manifestations, listening attentively to her often symbolic voice, whether expressed through dreams, moods, intuitions, or projections, understanding her needs and messages, differentiating her perspective from that of the ego and its defenses, and ultimately honoring her as an essential, wise, and life-giving partner in the profound quest for psychological wholeness. As this dedicated, courageous engagement unfolds over time, the man finds himself slowly but surely transforming, moving gradually from a state of psychic fragmentation towards greater integration, from being unconsciously driven by the anima's distorted energy towards consciously collaborating with her intrinsic wisdom. He begins to reclaim the lost connection to his own soul, not by abandoning or weakening his masculinity, but by enriching, deepening, balancing, and ultimately completing it through the conscious embrace of his full human potential. Guided by the integrated wisdom arising from the sacred inner marriage of his conscious mind and his rediscovered soul image, his anima